Hello, everyone, and welcome to Redacted Files, presented by Midnight Creaks. Tonight we're opening 8 files from 8 small towns, places where everything looks normal in daylight and nothing adds up after midnight. The reports are clean, the timelines are neat, the conclusions come fast. But in every case, there's one detail that shouldn't exist, and one witness statement that never made it into the final record. No monsters in the woods, just patterns, missing pages, and the kind of silence that shows up when someone powerful wants a story to end. If you're new here, subscribe to Midnight Creaks for daily horror told like an investigation, and turn on notifications, because the next file opens now. Detective Lawrence Finley had spent 17 years working cases across Maricopa County, but the call that came through dispatch on November 14th, 1997, seemed routine enough that he almost passed it to a junior investigator. A death at a roadside motel along Interstate 10, approximately 40 miles west of Phoenix. Initial report suggesting suicide. The Desert Star Motel was the kind of place that appeared every 30 miles along Arizona's long stretches of highway. Single-story 20-room establishments built in the 1960s that catered to traveling salesmen, long-haul truckers, and families stretching vacation budgets across the Southwest. The town of Harwell Creek, population Ulta 200, existed primarily as a service stop, offering gas, food, and cheap beds to those passing through the unforgiving expanse between Phoenix and the California border. What Finley would discover in room 12, however, would prove to be anything but routine, and the questions surrounding an ice machine would haunt him for the remainder of his career. The victim was identified as Alan Pritchard, age 42, a pharmaceutical sales representative from Tucson who had been traveling his regular route through western Arizona. According to motel records, Pritchard had checked in at 6 p.m. on November 13th, requesting a non-smoking room and paying cash for a single night. He had been found that morning by housekeeping staff member Dolores Kaminsky, who reported the body to the motel manager before calling emergency services. When Finley arrived at 10 a.m., the scene had already been contaminated by the manager, 2 housekeeping staff, and a local patrol officer who had secured the room but made no effort to preserve evidence outside the immediate bathroom area. Pritchard's body remained in the bathtub, wrists slit vertically along both radial arteries, a single-edge razor blade resting on the porcelain edge near his left hand. The bathwater had long since drained, leaving rust-colored stains along the tub's surface and a faint, metallic smell that mixed with industrial cleaner. What struck Finley immediately was the room's condition. Room 12 was spotless in a way that seemed unnatural for a suicide scene. The bed showed no signs of having been slept in, the corners still hospital tight, with the cheap floral comforter pulled taut across the mattress. Pritchard's suitcase sat unopened on the luggage rack, his toiletry bag zipped shut on the bathroom counter. No note, no empty alcohol bottles, no prescription containers that might suggest either intent or impairment. The only personal items that appeared to have been touched were Pritchard's wallet and car keys, both sitting in perfect alignment on the nightstand. Finley photographed the scene methodically, documenting the bathroom, the bedroom, and the small table near the window where an ice bucket sat filled to overflowing with perfectly formed cubes, water pooling onto the laminate surface and dripping steadily onto the carpet. Below, Dolores Kaminsky, when interviewed in the motel office, was visibly shaken but coherent. She had worked at the Desert Star for 11 years, and had found 2 previous deaths in that time, both natural causes involving elderly travelers. This was different, she insisted. She had knocked at 9 a.m. for turnover service, received no answer, and used her master key. The bathroom door had been open, the body immediately visible. What disturbed her more than the body itself was the ice bucket. She was certain, absolutely certain, that when she had passed room 12 the previous night around 11 p.m. during her final hallway check, the bucket had been empty and sitting upside down on the bathroom counter, the standard configuration for rooms awaiting guests. Now it was full, positioned on the table, dripping. She could not explain how it had been filled when the ice machine records showed no usage after 8 p.m. the previous evening. Motel manager Gerald Strickland presented himself as cooperative, but clearly anxious to have the matter resolved quickly and quietly. The Desert Star operated on thin margins, dependent on consistent highway traffic and its reputation for being clean, cheap, and problem-free. A suicide was unfortunate, but not necessarily damaging if handled correctly. A prolonged investigation, media attention, or suggestions of foul play could devastate the business permanently. Strickland explained that Pritchard had seemed perfectly normal during check-in, friendly but tired, asking only about nearby restaurants and what time the continental breakfast began. He had not requested ice, had not mentioned any personal troubles, and had given no indication of distress. Strickland urged Finley to consider the obvious explanation and move forward with the paperwork so the room could be cleaned and returned to service. However, the autopsy report that arrived 3 days later raised immediate concerns. The medical examiner, Dr. Francine Howell, noted that while the wrist lacerations were indeed the cause of death, the cutting pattern was inconsistent with typical self-inflicted wounds. The right wrist showed a deep, clean vertical cut that had severed the radial artery completely. The left wrist, however, showed 3 separate shallower cuts at slightly different angles, as if the blade had slipped or been applied with diminishing control. Dr. Howell's professional opinion was that, based on blood loss from the right wrist alone, Pritchard would have lost consciousness within 2 to 4 minutes, making it physiologically improbable that he could have maintained the coordination and strength necessary to complete the multiple cuts on his left wrist. She stopped short of ruling the death a homicide, noting that unusual circumstances did occasionally occur in suicides, but she recommended further investigation before final classification. Finley returned to the Desert Star Motel on November 19th, requesting access to any security or surveillance systems. Strickland explained that the property had minimal security, just a single analog camera system installed in 1989 that recorded the parking lot and the main hallway leading to rooms 8 through 16 on a continuous loop using VHS tapes that were reused every 7 days. He was reluctant to provide the tape from November 13th, citing guest privacy concerns, but relented when Finley obtained a formal warrant. The tape quality was poor, the timestamp barely visible in the lower corner, but it was functional enough to track movement along the corridor. Finley watched the footage in the motel office, fast-forwarding through hours of empty hallway until movement appeared. At 2:13 a.m. on November 14th, Pritchard's door opened. The man who emerged was clearly recognizable from driver's license photos, wearing jeans and a white undershirt, barefoot, walking with purpose down the hallway toward the ice machine mounted on the wall between rooms 11 and 13. The machine was an old Scotsman model, chrome-fronted with a pull-down chute door and a bin that held approximately 50 pounds of ice. Pritchard approached, stopped directly in front of it, and stood motionless. For 2 minutes and 47 seconds, he simply stood there, facing the machine, not moving, not appearing to breathe heavily or sway. Then he reached forward, opened the chute door, and appeared to lean in slightly as if listening to something inside the mechanism. The hallway lights flickered once, twice, and the video image rolled vertically for approximately 4 seconds before stabilizing. When the picture cleared, Pritchard was no longer at the ice machine. He was standing in his doorway 15 feet away, his white shirt now clinging to his torso as if soaked with water, his hair plastered to his head, his face directed straight down the hallway toward the camera. For 3 seconds, he stared directly into the lens, with an expression that Finley could only describe as blank recognition, then stepped backward into his room and closed the door. The hallway remained empty for the rest of the tape. Finley reviewed the sequence 8 times, trying to rationalize what he had seen. The video roll could be explained by electrical interference or magnetic degradation of the tape. The wet clothing was harder to explain, but not impossible. Perhaps Pritchard had taken a shower immediately before walking to the ice machine, and the timeline was compressed. What couldn't be rationalized was the instantaneous movement from the machine to the doorway without any visible transit, and the expression on Pritchard's face, which suggested neither suicidal despair nor simple confusion, but rather a kind of hollow compliance. Finley requested access to room 12 again, and was informed by Strickland that the room had already been professionally cleaned and returned to service. The bathroom had been scrubbed, the carpet shampooed, and all linens replaced. Any trace evidence that might have remained was now irrecoverably contaminated or destroyed. On November 22nd, Finley conducted interviews with other guests who had stayed at the Desert Star on the night of Pritchard's death. Room 11, directly adjacent, had been occupied by a couple from Nevada who reported hearing nothing unusual, though the wife mentioned being awakened around 2 a.m. by what she thought was the sound of the ice machine running continuously, a mechanical clanking that persisted for nearly 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. Room 13 had been vacant. Room 10 was occupied by a long-haul trucker named Raymond Buchanan, who had stayed at the Desert Star dozens of times over the past 5 years. Buchanan was more forthcoming than the couple, admitting that he specifically requested rooms away from the ice machine area because of complaints he had heard from other drivers. The machine had a reputation, he explained. It produced ice normally during the day, but at night, particularly between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., it would activate and run whether anyone was using it or not. Drivers claimed that the sound was wrong, not like ice cubes dropping into a bin, but more like coins or small metal objects clattering into a hollow container. Some said they had heard voices near the machine, conversational tones that seemed to come from inside the chute itself, though no one was ever visible in the hallway. Finley began pulling records from Harwell Creek's small municipal database and the county coroner's office. Over the previous 12 years, 3 other deaths had occurred at the Desert Star Motel. 2 were classified as natural causes, both involving individuals with documented heart conditions. The 3rd, from August 1991, was a drowning. A 37-year-old insurance adjuster named Marcus Tillman had been found in his bathtub, fully clothed, submerged in 8 inches of water with no signs of struggle. Toxicology had shown trace amounts of alcohol, but nothing approaching intoxication. The death had been ruled accidental, attributed to a possible seizure or fainting spell while bathing. Tillman had been staying in room 12. Finley requested the original case file and discovered that the responding officer had noted an unusual detail. The ice bucket in Tillman's room had been found filled and sitting on the nightstand, though Tillman's family later confirmed he never used ice and preferred warm beverages. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Finley met with Dr. Howell and presented the Tillman case alongside Pritchard's. She reviewed the autopsy photos from 1991 and noted similarities in the positioning of both bodies, a kind of deliberate arrangement that suggested neither panic nor natural collapse. She agreed to amend her report on Pritchard to indicate that homicide could not be ruled out and that further investigation was warranted. Strickland, when informed of this development, became hostile. He accused Finley of manufacturing a conspiracy to damage his business, threatened to contact county supervisors about harassment, and insisted that both deaths were tragic coincidences being exploited by an investigator looking for career advancement. He refused further cooperation and hired a lawyer to block additional access to motel property or records. On the night of December 8, 1997, Finley returned to the Desert Star Motel alone. He had obtained no formal authorization, simply drove to the property at 1 a.m. and parked in the far corner of the lot where the security camera's range did not extend. 7 rooms showed lights. The rest were dark, including room 12, which online booking systems showed as available despite being the cheapest room in the building. Finley waited in his car until 2 a.m., then walked to the hallway entrance and positioned himself 20 feet from the ice machine. The machine was silent, its chrome surface reflecting the dim fluorescent corridor lighting. At 2:11 a.m., it activated. The compressor hummed. The mechanism inside began its rhythmic churning, and ice began dropping into the internal bin with the expected hollow clatter. Finley approached slowly, listening. The sound was normal for 30 seconds, then shifted. The clattering became sharper, more metallic, like dozens of coins being poured from a height. The rhythm was wrong, too regular, almost conversational in its cadence. Finley stood directly in front of the machine, opened the chute door, and reached into the bin. His hand closed around a standard ice cube, cold and wet and unremarkable. He withdrew it and was about to close the door when he heard a voice. It was soft, conversational, almost friendly in tone, and it came unmistakably from inside the chute itself. The words were clear enough to understand, but distorted by echo and mechanical interference. "You can wash it off. You can make it clean." Finley jerked backward, dropping the cube, and watched as the machine produced one more piece. This one was different. It dropped into the chute, opening slowly, catching the light as it tumbled, and Finley saw immediately that it was not ice. It was cloudy and hard, roughly cube-shaped but irregular, and suspended inside the translucent material was something small and white and unmistakably organic. It looked like a tooth, a human molar with a partially visible root structure, frozen inside a chunk of what might have been ice, but possessed a strange, crystalline opacity that seemed wrong. Finley collected the object using a plastic evidence bag from his jacket and immediately left the property. The following morning, he submitted it to the State Forensic Laboratory with a request for priority analysis. The results arrived on December 15th and were inconclusive. The substance was water-based, containing trace minerals consistent with municipal water supplies in western Arizona, but also showed anomalous chemical markers that the lab could not identify. The embedded object was confirmed as a human tooth, specifically a lower second molar, age and origin undetermined. There was no match in any dental records database, and the tooth itself showed signs of environmental exposure inconsistent with being freshly extracted. The lab noted that the sample had degraded rapidly after removal from frozen storage, liquefying into ordinary water within 48 hours and leaving no residue except the tooth itself. Armed with this evidence, Finley attempted to obtain a warrant to excavate the area around the Desert Star Motel's ice machine and plumbing system. His request was denied. The county prosecutor's office determined that the evidence was too circumstantial, the connection to Pritchard's death too tenuous, and the risk of litigation from Strickland too high. Finley was instructed to close the Pritchard case as suicide with unusual circumstances and to cease further investigation. He filed a formal objection, citing the Tillman parallel and the physical evidence from the ice machine, but was overruled. On January 8, 1998, Alan Pritchard's death was officially classified as suicide, and the case file was archived. 3 months later, the Desert Star Motel underwent renovations. The old Scotsman ice machine was removed and replaced with a modern unit installed at the opposite end of the hallway near the office. The corridor serving rooms 8 through 16 was repainted, and the analog security system was upgraded to a digital format that no longer preserved footage older than 72 hours. Strickland announced the improvements in a local newspaper advertisement, emphasizing the motel's commitment to guest comfort and modern amenities. Room 12 received new carpeting and a complete bathroom refit, with all fixtures replaced. The room remained, however, consistently the cheapest option on the property, and was listed as available on booking websites more than 90% of the time. A statistical anomaly for a renovated room at a budget motel along a major highway. In 2004, a cold case blogger from Oregon named Felicity Tremaine began researching unusual motel deaths across the southwestern United States. She came across the Pritchard case while cross-referencing coroner's reports and contacted Finley, who had by then retired from active investigation. He shared his documentation, including the video footage, the lab report on the ice sample, and his theories about the machine. Tremaine filed a public records request for the evidence bag inventory from the Pritchard investigation, specifically asking for documentation of the ice sample. The request was partially fulfilled. The inventory listed frozen sample origin room 12 corridor ice machine, collected 12/8/97, but showed no description of contents or analysis results. A handwritten notation dated January 23, 1998, indicated that the sample had been disposed per standard protocol, material degraded. Tremaine published her findings on her blog in 2005, drawing connections between the Pritchard and Tillman deaths, the ice machine's reputation, and the rapid closure of the investigation. Local response was minimal. Strickland, still operating the Desert Star, threatened legal action for defamation, but never followed through. The blog post attracted moderate attention from true crime enthusiasts, but was dismissed by law enforcement officials as speculative fiction. Finley, interviewed for the Post, stated only that he believed something at the Desert Star Motel remained unexplained, and that institutional pressure to avoid controversy had prevented a thorough examination of the evidence. As of 2025, the Desert Star Motel remains operational under new ownership, Strickland having sold the property in 2011 and retired to Sedona. The building has been repainted, the sign replaced with LED lighting, and the parking lot resurfaced. Room 12 is still listed as available more than any other room, frequently offered at a discount for online bookings. The motel's review aggregators show an average rating of 3.2 stars, with occasional mentions in guest comments of strange sounds in the hallways at night and ice machines that activate without apparent cause. No further deaths have been reported at the property since 1997, though statistical analysis of booking patterns shows that Room 12 experiences an unusually high rate of early checkouts and guest transfers compared to other rooms in the building. Lawrence Finley died in 2019 at age 73. In his personal effects, his daughter found a sealed evidence bag containing a single human tooth and a handwritten note that read, "The machine knew something. It was trying to tell us. We chose not to listen." The tooth was submitted to a private forensics consultant who confirmed it was a lower second molar, heavily mineralized, consistent with prolonged exposure to groundwater or similar environments. The consultant noted that the Desert Star Motel had been built in 1967 directly over a section of land that had previously served as an unofficial dumping area for a now-defunct mining operation, though no formal environmental assessment had ever been conducted. What remains buried beneath the concrete foundation of the building? What might have leached into the water supply feeding the ice machine? And what voices might have been preserved in the frozen samples that passed through that machine for nearly 30 years are questions that remain unanswered. The Desert Star Motel stands as a reminder that some places accumulate history in ways that cannot be easily scrubbed away or repainted over. Travelers continue to pull off Interstate 10, seeking cheap beds and functioning air conditioning, unaware that they are sleeping above ground that has never been properly investigated. Room 12 remains available, always available, the cheapest room on the property, and its ice bucket sits upside down on the bathroom counter, waiting. In March 2015, Troy Blackwell moved into his dream home on Magnolia Ridge Drive, a newly developed subdivision carved into the clay hills outside Montgomery, Alabama. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch with vinyl siding the color of summer clouds, a 2-car garage, and a backyard that stretched toward a tree line of longspur pines. Troy was 34, an insurance adjuster who had spent the previous decade in a cramped apartment, saving every spare dollar. The house represented everything he had worked for: stability, space, a place to start a family with his wife, Gina. Magnolia Ridge was marketed as a quiet retreat from city life, offering affordable suburban living on lots that had been graded and cleared by Redfield Development Company just 18 months earlier. The streets were pristine. The lawns were young but well tended. 16 homes had been completed on the main loop, with another dozen planned for the adjacent phase. The neighborhood attracted young professionals and small families drawn by competitive pricing and the promise of new construction with no hidden problems. Troy was found dead on the morning of April 9, 2015, at the edge of a freshly opened sinkhole behind his property. He was discovered by Gina at sunrise, kneeling at the rim with his hands folded across his chest, face pressed into the dirt as if in prayer. His body was cold, his pajamas undisturbed except for a thin layer of clay dust that covered his arms and legs. The sinkhole itself was roughly 12 feet across, shallow at first glance, its edges smooth and circular in a way that seemed almost machined. There were no skid marks, no signs of collapsed debris, no loose soil piled at the rim. It looked as though the earth had simply opened like a doorway. The initial police report classified the scene as a possible suicide, though the responding officer, Deputy Malcolm Greer, noted in his log that the positioning seemed ritualistic and that the cause of death was unclear. Troy had no history of mental illness, no financial troubles beyond a mortgage, and no signs of struggle or foul play. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office treated it as an unexplained death pending autopsy results. Gina Blackwell insisted to investigators that her husband had been terrified of the backyard for weeks. She told Deputy Greer that Troy had started sleeping poorly in mid-March, waking at odd hours to stand at the sliding glass door and stare into the darkness. He complained of a sound, something rhythmic and low, like breathing, that seemed to come from beneath the patio. Gina had heard it once herself, a faint whoomp that made the windows hum, but she had dismissed it as settling or maybe wind in the crawl space. Troy became obsessed with it. He stopped using the backyard entirely, refused to let Gina open the sliding door after dark, and began researching soil instability online late into the night. 2 other families on Magnolia Ridge Drive had reported similar experiences. Lyle and Brandy Kepler, who lived 4 houses down, mentioned to neighbors at a block party that they had been hearing a low rumbling sound around 3 a.m. for several weeks. Brandy described it as like someone drumming their fingers on a table underneath us. The Keplers also discovered that their security doorbell camera had captured footage of Lyle stepping outside barefoot in the middle of the night, standing motionless on the driveway for nearly 3 minutes, and then walking back inside. Lyle had no memory of the event. When Brandy showed him the video, he became visibly shaken and refused to discuss it further. Across the street, April Saunders and her teenage son, Evan, experienced a similar incident. Evan's bedroom camera, installed after a break-in scare the previous year, recorded him standing at his window at 3:07 a.m., staring at the backyard, his breath fogging the glass. He returned to bed without waking. The next morning, Evan complained of sore feet and found clay dust on his soles, though he swore he had never left his room. The coroner assigned to Troy Blackwell's autopsy was Dr. Ann Caldwell, a 20-year veteran of the Montgomery County Medical Examiner's Office. Her initial findings were inconclusive but deeply unsettling. Troy's lungs contained fine particulate clay that matched samples taken from the sinkhole rim. The clay particles were embedded in the alveolar tissue, indicating prolonged inhalation. Yet there was no mud or dirt in his trachea or nasal passages. It was as if Troy had been breathing clay dust while still standing above ground. Dr. Caldwell also noted abrasions on Troy's fingertips and clay packed tightly under his nails, consistent with scraping at a hard, smooth surface. But there were no corresponding marks on the ground near his body. The toxicology report came back negative for drugs, alcohol, or poisons. There were no signs of asphyxiation, cardiac arrest, or blunt trauma. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined, with a note that self-harm could not be ruled out, though Dr. Caldwell privately told Deputy Greer that the findings didn't add up to anything I've seen before. Deputy Greer began his own inquiry after the autopsy report was filed. He drove out to Magnolia Ridge on a cloudy afternoon in late April and walked the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking residents about unusual activity. Several homeowners mentioned the late-night sounds. A man named Garrett Townsend, who lived at the far end of the loop, said his basement floor had developed hairline cracks in a pattern that looked too perfect, like someone drew them with a ruler. Another resident, Felicia Hargrave, reported that her dog refused to go into the backyard after dark and would whine at the sliding door until brought inside. Greer requested geological surveys of the subdivision from the county planning office. The records showed that Redfield Development had cleared and graded the land in late 2013, removing a dense layer of topsoil and compacting the underlying clay to prepare for foundation pours. The area had a history of karst topography, limestone bedrock riddled with natural voids and underground water channels. But a pre-construction survey had declared the site stable with proper drainage systems in place. No sinkholes had been reported in the immediate area for at least 30 years. Greer also discovered that Redfield Development had filed for a permit to conduct emergency remediation work on Magnolia Ridge just 2 days after Troy's death. The permit authorized the company to fill the sinkhole with concrete slurry to prevent further collapse and ensure public safety. The work was completed within 48 hours, and the sinkhole was sealed before any independent geological assessment could be conducted. Frustrated by the speed of the remediation, Greer contacted a forensic consultant named Leo Marsh, a retired civil engineer who specialized in construction disputes and soil failures. Marsh reviewed photographs of the sinkhole taken by the first responders and immediately flagged the smooth edges. He told Greer that natural sinkholes and clay soils typically exhibit rough, stepped walls with loose debris at the bottom. The Magnolia Ridge sinkhole, by contrast, appeared almost molded. Marsh suggested that the void could have been caused by subsurface erosion or possibly by mechanical excavation, though he noted that the latter would have left tool marks. Marsh also pointed out that the timing of the sinkhole's appearance within hours of Troy's death was statistically unusual. He recommended that Greer examine property records to determine whether Redfield Development had conducted any undocumented excavation or utility work in the area prior to the incident. Greer pulled the records and found something odd. Redfield Development had applied for a series of boring permits in February 2015, ostensibly to assess soil compaction and groundwater levels. The boring logs, however, were incomplete. Several test sites were marked on the map, but had no corresponding data entries. One of the unmarked sites was located directly behind Troy Blackwell's property, within 50 feet of where the sinkhole later opened. Greer returned to Magnolia Ridge on the evening of May 3rd, this time with a handheld thermal camera borrowed from the Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Division. He parked at the Kepler's house and set up surveillance in their side yard, aiming the camera at the sealed sinkhole location and the surrounding backyards. He sat in a folding chair with the camera running on a tripod, recording thermal data in 15-minute intervals. At 3:07 a.m., the thermal camera detected a sudden temperature shift. The ground around the sealed sinkhole began to glow faintly warmer than the surrounding earth, forming an oval-shaped heat signature roughly 12 feet across. Greer heard a low, resonant sound. Not quite a rumble, more like a deep, controlled exhalation that seemed to rise from beneath the concrete cap. The fence posts along the Blackwell's property line vibrated slightly, and Greer felt the vibration through the legs of his chair. The thermal image flickered. For a split second, the camera registered a human-shaped heat outline standing at the rim of the sealed sinkhole. Upright, arms at its sides, perfectly still. Greer looked up from the camera screen and scanned the yard. There was no one there. He was alone. The heat signature vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and the ground returned to ambient temperature. Greer immediately contacted the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and requested a full forensic excavation of the sealed sinkhole. His request was denied. The supervising lieutenant cited budget constraints, lack of probable cause, and the fact that the coroner had already closed the case as undetermined. The lieutenant also noted that Redfield Development had threatened legal action if the county interfered with the remediation work, arguing that further delays could harm property values and expose the county to liability. Undeterred, Greer reached out to Dr. Caldwell and shared his thermal camera footage. She agreed to review the data and, after consulting with a geophysicist at Auburn University, concluded that the temperature anomaly was consistent with either a subsurface thermal vent or the presence of decomposing organic material. The human-shaped heat signature, however, defied explanation. Dr. Caldwell wrote a supplemental memo to the coroner's office recommending that the case be reopened, but the memo was filed without action. In early June 2015, Redfield Development quietly approached every homeowner on Magnolia Ridge Drive with buyout offers. The offers were generous, 15% above market value, and included relocation assistance and waived closing costs. The company presented the buyouts as a goodwill gesture in light of unforeseen geological challenges and assured residents that the homes were structurally sound, but that the company wished to avoid future concerns. By the end of the month, all 16 families had accepted the offers and moved out. The homes on Magnolia Ridge Drive now sit empty. The lawns are mowed by a contracted maintenance crew every 2 weeks, and the driveways remain clear. The street is well lit, the mailboxes are polished, and the for sale signs have been removed. From the road, the subdivision looks pristine, ready for new residents who never arrive. Deputy Greer retired from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office in 2017. He lives in a neighboring county now and rarely discusses the Magnolia Ridge case. When pressed, he describes the investigation as incomplete and says that he still hears that sound in his sleep, the low rhythmic whoomp that seemed to come from beneath the earth, like something massive and patient, breathing. The neighboring subdivision, Oakwood Terrace, reported a similar incident in late 2023. A family's backyard developed a circular depression overnight, and the homeowner claimed to hear breathing sounds before the county filled the site with gravel. No investigation was conducted. In January 2017, Bryce Thornberry accepted what seemed like a straightforward assignment from his employer, a Denver-based digital marketing firm that specialized in vacation rental optimization. His task was to spend a long weekend at one of their clients' premium mountain properties, a newly renovated cabin in the Black Ridge Pines cluster, elevation 9,200 feet, 43 miles west of Boulder, and produce a comprehensive photo and video package that would highlight winter amenities for the upcoming booking season. His girlfriend, Audra Kincaid, a freelance graphic designer with flexible deadlines, decided to join him. The property management company, Summit Crest Rentals, had described the cabin as their flagship unit. Vaulted ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Continental Divide, smart home technology throughout, and a wood-burning stove that could heat the entire 1,400 square foot interior, even during blizzard conditions. What neither Bryce nor Audra could have known was that they would never leave that cabin alive, and that their deaths would expose a pattern of unexplained fatalities stretching back nearly 8 years. The Black Ridge Pines development consisted of 19 cabins scattered across a private 40-acre parcel of lodgepole pine forest, each structure positioned to maximize privacy while maintaining road access for year-round occupancy. Summit Crest Rentals had acquired the entire cluster in 2009, transforming what had been a family-owned timeshare operation into a premium short-term rental portfolio that generated approximately $840,000 in annual revenue. The cabins were marketed primarily to urban professionals seeking weekend escapes, winter sports enthusiasts, and remote workers looking for mountain retreats with reliable high-speed internet. Cabin 17, the unit assigned to Bryce and Audra, had undergone a $95,000 renovation in late 2016, including complete electrical rewiring, new insulation, upgraded HVAC systems, and the installation of a comprehensive smart home platform that controlled lighting, temperature, door locks, and security cameras from a centralized hub accessible via smartphone app. Bryce and Audra arrived at Cabin 17 on Friday, January 13th at approximately 4 p.m. The drive from Denver had taken 3 hours due to intermittent snow flurries, but road conditions were manageable, and the cabin's heated driveway had melted accumulation down to bare asphalt. Bryce documented their arrival with his professional camera rig, capturing exterior shots of the cabin's dark-stained cedar siding, the wraparound deck with propane fire pit, and the view westward towards snow-covered peaks that glowed pink in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the cabin matched its listing photos exactly. Open-concept living area with the promised vaulted ceiling, a kitchen island with quartz countertops, 2 bedrooms on the upper loft level, and a bathroom with heated floors. The smart home control panel, mounted near the front door, displayed current interior temperature at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior temperature at 22 degrees, and all systems functioning normally. Bryce sent a text message to his supervisor at 4:47 p.m. confirming their safe arrival and promising preliminary photos by Sunday evening. What happened over the next 48 hours would only be reconstructed later through forensic analysis, digital logs, and interviews with neighbors who heard sounds they couldn't explain. According to the timeline established by Boulder County Sheriff's investigators, Bryce and Audra spent Friday evening settling in, cooking dinner, and testing the cabin's various amenities for Bryce's photography project. They posted Instagram stories showing the fireplace, the mountain view at sunset, and Audra reading on the leather sofa with a glass of wine. All standard vacation content that gave no indication of distress. Saturday proceeded normally as well, with Bryce capturing drone footage of the surrounding forest and Audra working on laptop designs from the dining table. They texted family members, responded to work emails, and ordered pizza delivery from a restaurant in Nederland, 12 miles down the mountain, that arrived at 6:30 p.m. without incident. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came at 7:15 a.m. on Monday, January 16th, when a Summit Crest maintenance worker named Gordon Frey arrived for a routine furnace filter replacement, scheduled before Bryce and Audra's checkout time of 11 a.m. Gordon found the cabin's front door unlocked, but discovered Bryce and Audra's bodies on the living room floor, approximately 8 feet from the entryway. Both were fully dressed in winter coats, hats, and gloves. Bryce's car keys were clenched in his right hand. Audra's phone was on the floor beside her, screen shattered as if it had been dropped repeatedly. The cabin's interior temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The front door, Gordon would later tell investigators, swung open easily when he turned the knob. There was no ice, no mechanical failure, no obstruction of any kind. Yet Bryce and Audra had frozen to death inside a cabin with a functioning door, working heat, and no apparent reason why they couldn't simply walk outside. Boulder County Sheriff's Deputy Landon Strickland was the first law enforcement officer on scene, arriving at 7:52 a.m. after Gordon's frantic 911 call. What Landon observed in those first minutes would haunt him for years. The body showed signs of extreme physical exertion and panic. Bryce's fingernails were broken and bloody with wood splinters embedded in the torn tissue. Audra's knuckles were bruised and swollen. The hardwood floor near the front door was gouged and scratched in a pattern that suggested heavy furniture had been dragged across it repeatedly, though all furniture in the cabin appeared to be in its original position. Most disturbing was the evidence of their final hours, captured on their phones. Audra's device, once forensic technicians recovered its data, showed 73 attempted 911 calls between 1:04 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. on Sunday night. 73 calls that, according to cellular provider records, never connected to emergency services despite the cabin being well within coverage range and both phones showing full signal strength at the time. The thermostat logs presented the first major anomaly. The smart home system recorded temperature readings every 15 minutes, and those logs showed the cabin's heat, functioning normally throughout Saturday and into Sunday evening, maintaining a steady 68-71 degrees until approximately 12:50 a.m., when the temperature began dropping precipitously. But here was the inexplicable detail. The system logs showed the thermostat being manually adjusted to lower and lower settings between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., as if someone was deliberately turning down the heat. Yet Bryce's and Audra's phones, wallets, and car keys were all found near their bodies at the front door, suggesting they had been trying to escape, not adjust climate controls. The final thermostat entry, time-stamped 2:11 a.m., showed a setting of 38 degrees, well below freezing, even though the ambient outdoor temperature that night had only dropped to 19 degrees, and the cabin's insulation should have prevented such rapid heat loss. Landon contacted the property management company within hours of discovering the bodies, and Summit Crest's regional manager, a man named Malcolm Pritchett, arrived at the scene by noon. Malcolm had managed the Black Ridge Pines properties for 6 years and presented himself as shocked and bewildered by the deaths. He immediately authorized full access to all smart home system logs, security camera footage, and maintenance records. But it was what those digital records revealed that transformed this from a tragic accident into something far more disturbing. The smart door lock, which kept detailed logs of every lock and unlock event, showed the front door being unlocked 17 times between 1:10 a.m. and 1:50 a.m. on Sunday night. 17 separate unlock events, each triggered either by the interior thumb turn mechanism or by someone using the control panel's unlock button. Yet the door's open-close sensor, which should have recorded the door actually opening and closing, showed only a single open event at 1:10 a.m., followed by a sensor status that read, "Door ajar," for the next 40 minutes, even though the logs clearly showed multiple unlock attempts continuing every 2 to 3 minutes. What made this data even stranger was its pattern. The unlock timestamps didn't progress linearly. Instead, they looped back on themselves in a way that suggested either severe system malfunction or deliberate tampering. The log read 1:10:34 a.m., 1:11:02 a.m., 1:10:34 a.m., 1:13:47 a.m., 1:10:34 a.m., 1:16:19 a.m., with that specific 1:10:34 timestamp appearing 7 times in what should have been a 40-minute period. When technicians examined the thermostat's historical data, they found the identical looping pattern. Temperature adjustment commands, time-stamped in the same repeating sequence as if someone or something had been rewinding time in 2 to 3 minute intervals, forcing Bryce and Audra to relive the same moments over and over, while the cabin's interior temperature plummeted. A neighbor in cabin 12, approximately 200 yards through the trees, provided testimony that chilled even the most skeptical investigators. Iris Beckman, a retired school teacher from Fort Collins, who owned her cabin outright and spent most weekends there during ski season, told Deputy Strickland that she had been awakened around 2 a.m. Sunday night by a sound she described as methodical pounding, like someone hammering nails, but slower and more deliberate. The sound had come from the direction of cabin 17, and it had lasted approximately 15 to 20 minutes. But what disturbed Iris most was the acoustic quality of the pounding. It hadn't sounded like it was coming from outside the cabin or from someone striking the exterior walls. Instead, she said, it had sounded like someone was trapped inside the walls themselves, knocking to get out, or maybe knocking to warn someone not to come closer. When Iris went to her window to investigate, she could see lights on inside cabin 17, but no movement, no shadows passing in front of windows, no indication of human activity despite the ongoing pounding that seemed to resonate through the forest. Sheriff's investigators spent the following week conducting a comprehensive examination of cabin 17, and what they found suggested a history of suppressed incidents that Summit Crest Rentals had never disclosed. In the property management company's internal database, accessed through a search warrant executed on Malcolm Pritchett's office, investigators discovered 3 previous guest incident reports related to cabin 17, all dating from the period after its 2016 renovation. In March 2016, a family from Kansas had checked out 2 days early, citing severe disorientation and the feeling that the hallway was getting longer every time we walked toward the front door. In August 2016, a solo traveler had reported that the cabin's door wouldn't open from the inside after midnight, though maintenance logs showed no mechanical issues when staff tested it the next morning. In November 2016, just 2 months before Bryce and Audra's deaths, a couple had been found unconscious in the driveway at 4 a.m., suffering from hypothermia despite wearing full winter gear. They claimed they had finally made it outside after hours of trying to reach the door, though their account was dismissed as alcohol-related confusion, and the incident was never reported to authorities. Deputy Strickland, disturbed by these patterns and determined to understand what had killed Bryce and Audra, convinced Malcolm Pritchett to authorize a controlled overnight test of the cabin. On the night of January 24th, 8 days after the bodies were discovered, Landon and a volunteer fire captain named Hugh Carlisle spent the hours from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. inside cabin 17 with full recording equipment, temperature monitors, and emergency communication protocols. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual occurred. The cabin behaved exactly as expected, warm, well lit, with all systems responding normally to manual controls. But at 12:58 a.m., Hugh noticed something that made him stop mid-sentence during their recorded observations. The hallway connecting the living area to the front door, a straight corridor that measured exactly 16 feet and 3 inches according to the original construction blueprints, appeared subtly longer. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be immediately obvious, but enough that Hugh could see the front door receding, as if viewed through a very slight telephoto lens effect. Landon and Hugh approached the door together, and as they crossed into the final 5 feet of hallway, both men reported experiencing identical symptoms. Sudden onset of intense pressure in their ears and sinuses, similar to rapid altitude gain, accompanied by a feeling of profound wrongness that Landon would later describe as, like your body knows you're about to step off a cliff, even though your eyes see flat ground. When Landon reached for the door handle, his hand began trembling uncontrollably. Not from cold or fear, he insisted, but from some external force that seemed to resist his forward motion. At precisely that moment, Hugh's emergency radio, which had been silent all night, erupted with a burst of static so loud and sustained that it temporarily deafened both men. When the static cleared, for approximately 3 seconds, both men swore they heard a woman's voice, calm, matter-of-fact, and absolutely terrifying in its clarity, whisper through the radio speaker, "You can't go out, you'll let it in." Neither man waited to investigate further. They backed away from the door, returned to the center of the living room, and remained there until 3 a.m., when the agreed-upon test period ended and backup personnel entered from outside to extract them. When questioned later about why he didn't simply walk the 16 feet to the unlocked door and leave immediately after the radio incident, Landon couldn't provide a rational explanation beyond saying that some deep survival instinct had told him that attempting to cross that threshold after midnight would result in consequences he couldn't predict or control. The cabin's smart home logs from that night showed no unusual activity, no looping timestamps, no phantom unlock attempts, but independent electromagnetic field measurements taken by the fire department did reveal unexplained interference patterns concentrated in a 5-foot radius around the front door's interior threshold. Patterns that cycled in regular intervals every 110 seconds. Within 48 hours of the overnight test, Summit Crest Rentals quietly removed Cabin 17 from all active booking platforms. The property was assigned a new internal identification code, changing from Unit SC-17 to Unit SC-24B, and its listing photos, descriptions, and rental history were scrubbed from the company's website. Malcolm Pritchett issued a brief statement to local media attributing Bryce and Audra's deaths to a tragic combination of carbon monoxide exposure, hypothermia, and medical factors that impaired their judgment, though the county coroner's report explicitly noted that all carbon monoxide detectors in the cabin had been functional and showed no triggering events, and that toxicology screens on both victims revealed no drugs, alcohol, or elevated CO levels in their blood. The official cause of death, as recorded on both death certificates, was listed as environmental exposure with contributing factors of disorientation and hypothermia, a phrasing carefully crafted to avoid any suggestion of supernatural phenomena, while also acknowledging that 2 healthy adults had frozen to death inside a heated, unlocked cabin under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Boulder County declined to pursue criminal charges against Summit Crest Rentals, citing insufficient evidence of negligence or deliberate wrongdoing. Though the company did settle undisclosed civil claims with both the Thornberry and Kincaid families in exchange for confidentiality agreements. Cabin 17, or Unit SC-24B as it appears in current property records, remains part of the Black Ridge Pines development, but has never been relisted for short-term rental. Property tax records show it as owner-occupied, though no permanent resident has ever been documented living there. Maintenance workers who service other cabins in the cluster have reported that lights occasionally turn on in SC-24B at night, visible through the trees, and that the smart home system continues to generate activity logs showing temperature adjustments and door lock cycles, even though the cabin supposedly sits empty. When pressed, Malcolm Pritchett, who still manages Summit Crest's portfolio, will only say that certain properties require extended maintenance periods, and that Cabin 17 falls into that category indefinitely. For Iris Beckman, who still owns Cabin 12 and continues to spend winter weekends in Black Ridge Pines, the pounding she heard that night in January 2017 occasionally returns, always around 2 a.m., always with the same deliberate rhythm, always seeming to emanate from inside solid matter rather than from any direction she can pinpoint. She no longer investigates when she hears it. She has learned, like the few other permanent residents of the development, that there are cabins in these mountains where space doesn't behave according to the rules that govern the rest of the world, where thresholds become traps, and where the simple act of walking toward a door can trap you in an endless loop of almost escape. The locals who know the development's history have a saying now, shared in whispers at the Netherland General Store or in quiet conversations at the county building department. Some cabins don't have exits, they have invitations. And once you accept that invitation after dark, the only choice left is whether you'll freeze trying to leave or learn to accept that you're exactly where you were always meant to stay. In October 2008, Malcolm Ingram accepted a contract that seemed routine enough. Noise mitigation analysis for the California Department of Transportation District 7. The project centered on the Lambert-Ashby interchange, a sprawling concrete ribbon where Interstate 210 crossed State Route 134 in the San Gabriel Valley foothills. The assignment called for baseline acoustic measurements, vibration studies, and recommendations for sound barrier placement to satisfy complaints from residents in the neighborhoods below. Malcolm had spent 15 years in acoustic engineering, primarily consulting on amphitheater design and industrial noise compliance. Highway work was less glamorous but paid consistently, and he appreciated the technical precision required to model how sound propagated through urban canyons of steel and concrete. The Lambert-Ashby project came with standard documentation, traffic volume projections, construction blueprints from 1991, and a folder of noise complaints dating back 18 months. Nothing in the initial briefing suggested anything extraordinary. What Malcolm's briefing packet did not mention What he would not learn until 3 days into his field work was that the Lambert-Ashby interchange had become the site of 5 suicides in the previous 14 weeks. All 5 had occurred on the same section of elevated roadway, the northbound 210 overpass spanning the 134, a stretch of barrier-lined concrete approximately 400 feet long. All 5 victims had climbed over the 4-foot concrete barrier during evening hours, then stepped or jumped into traffic 42 feet below. All 5 died instantly. The first death occurred on July 11, 2008. Brenda Forsyth, a 53-year-old dental hygienist from Altadena, pulled her sedan onto the shoulder at 9:47 p.m. She left her engine running, her purse on the passenger seat, and walked directly to the barrier. 2 motorists saw her climb over with what they later described as careful, almost reverent deliberation. She did not look back. She did not appear distressed. Traffic camera footage reviewed afterward showed her standing at the edge for approximately 23 seconds, head tilted slightly as if listening, before stepping forward. The second death followed on August 6th. Kurt Denham, a 29-year-old software developer from Glendale, parked his motorcycle in the same approximate location Brenda Forsyth had used. Witnesses reported that he removed his helmet, set it neatly on the seat, and walked to the barrier without hesitation. Like Forsyth, he paused at the edge, this time for roughly 40 seconds, appearing calm and focused before he fell. By the time Malcolm Ingram arrived in late October, 3 more victims had followed the same pattern. Octavia Pruitt, a 41-year-old nurse, Jerome Talbot, a 67-year-old retired postal worker, and Annika Svensson, a 19-year-old college sophomore. Different ages, different backgrounds, different times of evening, but identical behavior. Calm approach, deliberate climb, listening pause, unhesitating step. None left notes. None had histories of suicidal ideation. None showed signs of intoxication or drugs in toxicology reports. The California Highway Patrol categorized the deaths as suicide cluster, a recognized psychological phenomenon where media coverage or community awareness of one suicide can trigger vulnerable individuals toward imitation. The CHP installed additional signage directing people in crisis to call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health issued statements about recognizing warning signs. Caltrans expedited plans for taller barriers, an 8-foot fence proposal already in preliminary design for other high-risk overpasses. But 2 details troubled the investigators, details that never reached public statements and only appeared in internal incident reports. First, 3 of the 5 victims had been wearing earbuds or headphones when they died. Yet post-mortem examination of their devices showed no music, podcasts, or audio files playing at the time. Second, Jerome Talbot's cell phone, recovered from his jacket pocket, contained a voice memo started accidentally at 10:14 p.m., 37 seconds of recording captured in the moments before his death. The audio quality was poor, dominated by wind noise and the roar of traffic below. But buried beneath that roar, audible only when isolated and amplified in the lab, was something else. A faint, layered sound like distant voices singing in harmony. Malcolm learned about the suicides on his 3rd site visit. He had been taking vibration measurements at 11 p.m., using accelerometers mounted to the overpass support columns, when a CHP patrol car pulled alongside. The officer, a veteran named Sergeant Tim Bradshaw, asked what he was doing and why he was working so late. Malcolm explained the noise study, mentioned that nighttime measurements were necessary to establish baseline conditions without peak traffic interference. Bradshaw leaned against his patrol car, arms crossed, and said, "You know about the jumpers?" Malcolm did not. Bradshaw told him in the flat, careful language of someone who had written too many incident reports. 5 deaths, same spot, always evening or night. "We've got a fence going up next month," Bradshaw said. "But between you and me, it doesn't feel like the usual copycat thing. These people weren't distraught. They were focused." Malcolm asked what he meant by focused. "Like they were following instructions," Bradshaw said. That conversation changed the scope of Malcolm's work, though not officially. Caltrans had not hired him to investigate suicides. His contract specified acoustic and vibration analysis for noise mitigation purposes, nothing more. But the engineer in him could not ignore a potential mechanical factor. If something about the structure's acoustic properties was affecting human behavior, disorienting drivers, triggering vertigo, exacerbating mental distress, it fell squarely within his expertise. Over the next week, Malcolm expanded his measurements. He returned to the overpass nightly between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., when traffic thinned enough to isolate structural vibration from vehicle-generated noise. He positioned sensors along the barrier where victims had climbed, on the deck surface, on the support beams beneath. He recorded frequency spectrums, resonance patterns, and ambient sound profiles. What he found was unusual but not immediately alarming. The overpass exhibited strong resonance at a narrow frequency band around 19 Hz, below the threshold of human hearing, but well within the range that could be felt as vibration. This resonance occurred specifically during periods of light traffic, when the structural loading decreased and the concrete relaxed into its natural vibrational mode. It was, in engineering terms, a form of wind-induced vortex shedding combined with traffic pulse loading, creating a feedback loop that caused the deck to vibrate at its fundamental frequency, 19 Hz. Malcolm cross-referenced the number with existing literature on infrasound and human perception. The frequency fell within what researchers called the fear frequency range, low-frequency sound and vibration known to induce feelings of anxiety, dread, and unease in laboratory settings. Some studies suggested that prolonged exposure to 19 Hz could trigger visual hallucinations, dissociative states, and intense emotional reactions. The effect was not universal. Individual sensitivity varied, but it was documented and replicable. Malcolm wrote a preliminary report outlining his findings and recommending structural dampening measures. He submitted it to his Caltrans project manager on November 4th, framing it as a potential contributing factor to driver stress and suggesting that mitigation might reduce accident risk. The response came back 3 days later. Appreciated, noted for future consideration, but outside the current scope of work. Please focus on ambient noise levels for barrier design. He should have stopped there. His contract did not cover structural resonance studies. He had documented the issue, flagged it for the state, fulfilled his professional obligation. But the question gnawed at him. If the overpass resonated at a frequency known to affect human psychology, and if that resonance peaked during evening hours when traffic was light, could it explain why 5 people, all during evening hours, all in the same location, had calmly climbed over a barrier and stepped into traffic? Malcolm returned to the site on November 12th at 3:30 a.m., the statistical low point for traffic volume on the 210 corridor. He brought portable recording equipment, binaural microphones, and a high-sensitivity vibration sensor array. He parked in the exact spot where 3 of the victims had left their vehicles, killed his engine, and walked to the barrier. The air was cold and still. Below, the 130 Fuß carried only occasional trucks, their headlights sweeping long arcs through the darkness. Malcolm placed his hand on the concrete barrier and waited. For the first few minutes, he felt nothing unusual, just the faint, irregular thrum of distant traffic transmitted through the structure. Then, during a lull when no vehicles passed on either highway for nearly 40 seconds, he felt it. A low, sustained vibration that seemed to rise from deep within the concrete itself. It was rhythmic, almost musical, like the hum of a pipe organ's lowest register felt rather than heard. The sensation traveled up his arm into his chest and settled somewhere behind his sternum, a physical pressure that had no source he could identify. Malcolm checked his sensor readout. The frequency spectrum showed a sharp, sustained peak at 18.7 hertz, far stronger than his previous measurements. The vibration was coherent, organized, as if the entire structure had synchronized into a single oscillating system. And then, just for a moment, lasting perhaps 5 seconds, the vibration seemed to shift upward into the audible range, transforming from pure bass rumble into something that resembled a chord, multiple tones layered together in rough harmony. He felt a sudden intrusive thought. Move closer to the edge. You need to understand. The thought was not his own. It arrived fully formed, calm and insistent, carrying a certainty that had no logical foundation. Malcolm gripped the barrier, fingers pressing into cold concrete, and forced himself to focus on the data. The sensor showed the resonance peaking, then beginning to decay as a semi-truck approached from the east, its mass damping the oscillation. The chord-like quality faded. The intrusive thought receded. Malcolm looked to his left. For a fraction of a second, he saw figures standing along the barrier, 5 or 6 silhouettes perfectly still, facing outward. Then his eyes adjusted, and he realized they were only shadows cast by the overhead sodium vapor lights. But the lights were behind him. The shadows should not exist. He packed his equipment, returned to his car, and sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before his hands stopped shaking. The report Malcolm submitted the following morning was blunt and detailed. He described the 19 hertz resonance, the auditory illusion during peak vibration, the intrusive cognition he had experienced, and the potential connection to the 5 deaths. He recommended immediate structural dampening, temporary closure during low traffic hours, and psychological evaluation of anyone reporting unusual experiences on the overpass. He sent it directly to the District 7 chief engineer, copying his project manager and the CHP liaison. The response arrived within 6 hours. A terse email thanking him for his thoroughness, informing him that the matter would be reviewed internally, and terminating his contract, effective immediately due to budgetary realignment. The final line suggested that he refrained from public discussion of his findings due to ongoing legal sensitivities surrounding the tragic incidents. Malcolm never received clarification on what legal sensitivities meant. He was paid in full for work completed. His preliminary noise study was incorporated into the barrier design. His resonance report disappeared into internal channels and was never publicly acknowledged. In December 2008, Caltrans installed 8-foot mesh fencing along the northbound 210 overpass at Lambert Ashby, extending the barrier height and adding angled extensions at the top to prevent climbing. The project was framed as suicide prevention infrastructure, part of a statewide initiative to reduce bridge and overpass fatalities. Press releases did not mention structural vibration or acoustic resonance. Public statements emphasized mental health resources and community support. No further suicides occurred at Lambert Ashby after the fence installation. In March 2009, a cluster of 3 suicides occurred on the northbound 5 overpass at Fletcher Drive, approximately 9 miles southwest. The victims exhibited identical behavior: calm approach, listening pause, unhesitating step. All 3 deaths occurred during evening hours. None left notes. The Fletcher overpass had been built in 1993 using the same pre-stressed concrete box girder design as Lambert Ashby. Malcolm Ingram received no calls from Caltrans regarding the Fletcher deaths. By that time, he had shifted his consulting practice away from highway work entirely, focusing on architectural acoustics and concert hall design. He occasionally monitored news reports about freeway suicides in Los Angeles County, noting the recurring patterns, the specific times of day, the descriptions of victims who seemed calm or purposeful rather than distressed. In a 2011 interview with a graduate student researching infrastructure psychology, Malcolm spoke briefly about the Lambert Ashby project, describing it as an example of how structural resonance can create unexpected perceptual effects, but declining to provide specifics. The interview was never published. The student's dissertation focused on different case studies. The Lambert-Ashby interchange remains in service, carrying over 180,000 vehicles daily. The 8-foot fence installed in 2008 has never been removed. The northbound 2 and 10 overpass no longer appears on CHP high-risk location lists. Internal Caltrans memos from 2009-2010, obtained years later through public records requests, contain references to structural acoustic concerns and vibration mitigation studies at multiple interchange locations, but no detailed technical reports are attached. The memos recommend that future overpass designs incorporate dampening measures as a precautionary standard, without explaining what specific hazards those measures are meant to address. The Fletcher Drive overpass received an 8-foot fence in April 2009, 1 month after the 3rd suicide. Malcolm Ingram no longer drives freeways at night. When asked why, he says only that he prefers surface streets. Quieter, less stressful, better for thinking. He does not mention the sensation he still feels sometimes when crossing certain overpasses during evening hours. A faint vibration rising through the steering wheel into his hands, and beneath the traffic noise, almost imperceptible. Something that sounds like voices singing in a language he cannot identify. The concrete sings, the city built fences. And somewhere in the archives of the California Department of Transportation, buried in reports marked for internal review only, lies documentation of a phenomenon that 5 people heard clearly enough to follow its invitation into empty air. They heard the choir. The city heard nothing. And in the gap between those 2 truths, the question remains: how many other structures sing, and who else is listening? The invitation arrived in mid-October 1998, 7 years after the death, typewritten on cream-colored stationery that still bore the embossed seal of Ashwood Academy. It was addressed to Claudia Brennan, who had built a modest reputation as a freelance journalist specializing in cold cases involving institutional negligence The letter was unsigned, but the return address listed a post office box in Litchfield County, Connecticut. Inside a single sentence, Malcolm Reese did not drown by accident, and I can prove it. Claudia had never heard of Malcolm Reese, but 20 minutes of online research told her enough to understand why someone might reach out after so many years. In February 1991, the 18-year-old scholarship student from Hartford had been found floating face down in the ornamental pond on Ashwood Academy's campus, discovered the morning after the school's annual winter formal. The official conclusion, delivered swiftly by both the school's administration and the local medical examiner, was accidental drowning, complicated by alcohol intoxication. The pond had frozen over during an early cold snap, and the prevailing theory held that Malcolm, disoriented and inebriated, had wandered onto the ice, fallen through a weak spot, and been unable to pull himself out. His parents, a bus driver and a hospital custodian who had pinned all their hopes on their son's academic promise, accepted a settlement from the school's insurance carrier and signed a non-disclosure agreement. The case was closed within 6 weeks, but Claudia's anonymous correspondent insisted that the official story was a fabrication, and something about the spare, precise language of that typed invitation convinced her to drive north from her apartment in New Haven. Ashwood Academy, she learned, was not merely a boarding school, but a multi-generational institution that had been grooming the children of Connecticut's elite since 1887. Its sprawling campus, nestled in the wooded hills west of Litchfield, encompassed 400 acres of manicured lawns, stone dormitories, and academic buildings designed to evoke English country estates. The school's endowment exceeded $200 million, and its alumni network included senators, federal judges, Fortune 500 executives, and at least one Supreme Court justice. Ashwood did not advertise. It did not need to. Admission was reserved for the children of legacy families, with a handful of slots allocated each year to scholarship students chosen for their exceptional academic records and their potential to reflect well on the institution's commitment to diversity and merit. Malcolm Reese had been one of those scholarship students, a quiet, diligent young man who had earned a full ride after finishing first in his class at a Hartford public high school. By all accounts, he had struggled to fit into Ashwood's insular social ecosystem, but he had maintained a near-perfect GPA and had been on track to graduate with honors in the spring of 1991. The winter formal, held each February in the school's grand dining hall, was one of Ashwood's most storied traditions. A black tie affair where students danced to live orchestral music and alumni returned to network and reminisce. It was supposed to be a celebration of continuity and shared identity, but for Malcolm, it had been the last night of his life. Claudia arrived at Ashwood Academy on a gray November afternoon, nearly 8 years after Malcolm's death. The campus looked like a postcard from an earlier century, all ivy-covered walls and wrought iron gates. But there was an undercurrent of stillness that felt less peaceful than watchful. She had arranged a meeting with the school's current headmaster, a man named Cornelius Lowell. By presenting herself as a journalist, researching a feature on New England boarding schools and their evolving approaches to student safety. Lowell, a silver-haired man in his early 60s who wore a navy blazer and spoke in the measured cadences of someone accustomed to deflecting scrutiny, received her in his wood-paneled office overlooking the main quad. He was polite, but guarded, and when Claudia mentioned Malcolm Reese's name, his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "That was a terrible tragedy," Lowell said, folding his hands on his desk. "But it was thoroughly investigated at the time, and the findings were conclusive. Malcolm had been drinking, which was against school policy, and he made a series of unfortunate choices that night. We instituted new safety protocols afterward, including mandatory supervision during all formal events and stricter enforcement of our substance abuse policies. I'm not sure what more there is to say." Claudia nodded and took notes, but she did not miss the way Lowell's gaze kept drifting toward the window, as if he were calculating something. She asked if she could tour the campus, and Lowell agreed, assigning a young assistant dean named Rory Hollis to accompany her. Hollis, a recent Ashwood graduate who'd returned to work in the admissions office, was eager and talkative. But when Claudia asked to see the pond where Malcolm had died, his enthusiasm faltered. He led her across the quad and down a tree-lined path that opened onto a small landscaped area near the edge of the campus. The pond itself was gone, replaced by a sunken garden with neatly trimmed hedges and a circular stone patio. A brass plaque mounted on a low wall read, "In memory of those who walked these grounds." "They renovated it in 1995, Hollis explained, his voice quieter now. "The pond was considered a liability after what happened. The garden is supposed to be a place for reflection." Claudia studied the space, noting the precise oval shape of the sunken area and the way the ground sloped gently downward toward the center. It was easy to imagine water filling that depression, and she could see how the pond's shallow depth, which school records indicated had been no more than 3 feet at its deepest point, would have made Malcolm's drowning seem implausible to anyone who looked closely. But what struck her most was the way the air felt colder here, as if the garden retained some vestige of the winter night when Malcolm had died. Hollis shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward the main campus, and Claudia sensed that he wanted to leave. She thanked him and told him she could find her way back on her own. After Hollis departed, Claudia walked the perimeter of the garden looking for anything that might corroborate her anonymous correspondent's claim. She found nothing obvious, but as she circled the eastern edge, she noticed a small maintenance shed partially obscured by a stand of evergreens. The shed's door was unlocked, and inside she found the usual assortment of gardening tools, hoses, and electrical panels. She was about to leave when she noticed a gap behind one of the panels, as if it had been pulled slightly away from the wall. Crouching down, she reached into the gap and felt something smooth and rectangular. She pulled it out carefully. It was a Polaroid photograph, its colors faded but still legible, protected by a plastic sleeve and secured to the back of the panel with yellowed tape. The photograph showed a young man standing at the edge of a pond, his formal attire disheveled and his eyes wide with what looked like terror. In the background, partially obscured by darkness, were several figures in tuxedos, their faces blurred but their postures unmistakable, arms raised, holding what appeared to be a rope. The date stamped in the corner read, February 16th, 1991. The night of Malcolm Reese's death. Claudia's hands shook as she examined the image, and she noticed something else. A torn edge along the bottom of the plastic sleeve, as if a second photograph had been removed. She slipped the Polaroid into her jacket and left the shed, her mind racing. The image was not proof of murder in a legal sense, but it was evidence of something far more sinister. than an accidental drowning. She needed to find out who had left the photograph there and who had sent her the invitation. Over the next 3 days, Claudia conducted interviews with former students, faculty members, and staff who had been at Ashwood in 1991. Most were reluctant to speak on the record, but a pattern began to emerge. Several people mentioned a tradition among the senior class, a hazing ritual that took place during the winter formal and involved humiliating tasks assigned to underclassmen. No one would provide specifics, but the implication was clear. Malcolm had been targeted because he was an outsider, a scholarship student who didn't share the pedigree or social connections of his wealthier peers. Claudia eventually tracked down a former janitor named Leon Wolfe, who had worked at Ashwood from 1985 until his retirement in 1996. Wolfe, now in his 70s and living in a modest house in Torrington, agreed to meet with her after she explained that she was investigating Malcolm's death. He told her that he had always believed the drowning was staged, and that he had been the one who found the Polaroid behind the maintenance panel 2 weeks after Malcolm's body was recovered. He had considered going to the police, but the school's head of security at the time, a former state trooper named Gerald Ashton, had visited him at home and strongly advised him to forget what he had seen. Wolfe, who had a family to support and no desire to antagonize powerful people, had complied. But he had never forgotten the image. When he learned that Claudia was looking into the case, he had sent the anonymous invitation, hoping that someone with resources and distance might succeed where he had failed. Armed with the photograph and Wolfe's testimony, Claudia contacted the Connecticut State Police and requested that Malcolm Reese's case be reopened. The state's cold case unit assigned a detective named Moira Calloway, who reviewed the original investigation files and quickly identified significant irregularities. The medical examiner's report, for instance, noted bruising on Malcolm's wrists and forearms that was inconsistent with a simple fall through ice. But the findings had been dismissed as post-mortem trauma caused by the body's movement in the water. The report also mentioned that Malcolm's blood alcohol level, while elevated, was not high enough to render him incapacitated, and that his shoes had been found neatly arranged on the shore, aligned as if they had been placed there deliberately. Most troubling, the pond's surface ice had been photographed by campus security on the morning Malcolm's body was discovered, and the images showed a single, oval-shaped opening in the ice, with clean, almost surgical edges that suggested the hole had been cut or melted rather than broken by a fall. Detective Calloway interviewed witnesses who had attended the 1991 winter formal, and several of them, emboldened by the passage of time and the knowledge that Claudia's reporting had already made the case public, provided statements describing what they had seen. A former student named Gretchen Aldridge, who had been a sophomore in 1991, recalled seeing a group of seniors lead Malcolm toward the pond around midnight, and she remembered hearing laughter and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ice. Another witness, a faculty member who had chaperoned the event, admitted that he had seen Malcolm standing near the pond with several older students, but he had assumed they were simply talking and had not intervened. The faculty member, whose name was redacted in the official report, also acknowledged that he had been instructed by the school's administration not to mention the incident in his initial statement to police. The investigation took a dramatic turn in early 1999 when Detective Calloway, obtained a warrant to search the school's archives, which were housed in a climate-controlled vault beneath the main library. Among the files, she discovered a leather-bound ledger that documented internal disciplinary actions dating back to the 1950s. The ledger, which had never been disclosed to law enforcement during the original investigation, contained entries describing a practice known as the pond trial, in which senior students subjected underclassmen to a series of endurance tests during the winter formal. The tests, which were framed as a way to build character and resilience, included forcing participants to stand on the frozen pond, while senior students struck the ice with mallets to create cracks, simulating the risk of drowning. The ledger indicated that the pond trial had been discontinued in the late 1970s after a student nearly died, but there was evidence that the practice had continued informally, passed down through certain cliques within the senior class. Further investigation revealed that several of the students who had been present at the pond on the night Malcolm died were now prominent professionals in finance, law, and politics. Detective Calloway interviewed them one by one, and while most denied any direct involvement, their accounts were riddled with inconsistencies and gaps. One former student, who had become a corporate attorney, eventually admitted under questioning that the seniors had subjected Malcolm to the pond trial as a prank that had gone too far. According to this witness, Malcolm had been forced to stand on the ice while the seniors used a heated metal bar to create a hole beneath his feet. The plan, as described, was to let him fall into the shallow water and then pull him out. But something had gone wrong. Malcolm had panicked and resisted, and in the struggle, one of the seniors had held his head underwater to calm him down. By the time they realized he was not breathing, it was too late. The seniors, terrified of the consequences, had staged the scene to make it look like an accidental drowning and had sworn each other to secrecy. In April 1999, the Connecticut State's Attorney charged 4 former Ashwood Academy students with involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to obstruct justice. 2 of them accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against the others, and the remaining 2 were convicted after a trial that drew national media attention. The presiding judge, in his sentencing remarks, condemned the culture of entitlement and impunity that had allowed the crime to remain hidden for nearly a decade. The convicted men received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years in prison. Ashwood Academy's Board of Trustees issued a public apology to Malcolm's family and announced a series of reforms, including the dissolution of all student-run traditions not supervised by faculty, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to investigate historical misconduct. The school's enrollment dropped by 30% over the following 2 years, and its once pristine reputation was permanently tarnished. Claudia Brennan's reporting on the case won several journalism awards and was later adapted into a documentary that aired on public television. But the recognition brought her little satisfaction. She had spoken with Malcolm's parents multiple times during the investigation, and she had seen the way their grief had calcified into a kind of permanent, quiet rage. They had been robbed not only of their son, but of any illusion that his death had been an accident, and the knowledge that he had died in terror, betrayed by peers who saw him as disposable, was a wound that would never heal. The settlement they had accepted in 1991, which had seemed generous at the time, now felt like hush money. and they would spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have happened if they had pushed harder for answers when it mattered most. Years later, Claudia returned to the Ashwood campus to visit the memorial garden. It was early winter and the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost. She noticed that the frost had settled unevenly across the sunken garden, forming an oval pattern that matched the shape of the old pond. The air was colder there than anywhere else on campus, and as she stood at the edge of the garden, she thought she heard a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone knocking slowly and deliberately on a hard surface. She looked around, but the campus was empty. The sound faded, and she was left alone with the silence and the certainty that some places, no matter how carefully they are renovated or renamed, never truly forget what happened within their borders. In the spring of 1992, 31-year-old geologist Amanda Smith accepted what seemed like a straightforward consulting contract with Whispering Caverns, a privately owned cave attraction nestled in the limestone hills outside Bramwell, Kentucky. The small town of fewer than 800 residents had long depended on the cave system as its primary tourist draw, bringing in visitors from across the tri-state area who wanted to experience one of the region's most extensive underground networks. Amanda had been hired to conduct a routine geological assessment for potential expansion of the tour routes, a project that would allow her to combine her professional expertise with her lifelong fascination with subterranean formations. She arrived in Bramwell on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, her truck loaded with surveying equipment, thermal imaging cameras, and enough enthusiasm to sustain her through what she assumed would be a 3-week assignment. What Amanda would discover in the depths beneath those quiet Kentucky hills would haunt her for the rest of her life and expose a conspiracy of silence that had persisted for nearly 2 decades. Bramwell itself presented the quintessential image of rural Appalachian charm. Main Street stretched for 3 blocks, lined with brick storefronts that had served the same families for generations. The Bramwell Historical Society occupied a converted Methodist church on the north end of town, its white clapboard exterior freshly painted each spring by volunteers. 2 diners, a hardware store, a post office, and a single traffic light comprised the commercial district. Most residents worked either at the cave attraction itself, which employed 23 people year-round, or commuted to larger towns for manufacturing and service jobs. The population had remained remarkably stable since the 1970s, with minimal turnover and a strong sense of community identity built around local history and the natural wonder that drew outsiders to their doorstep. Whispering Caverns had operated as a tourist attraction since 1974, when landowner Gerard Montrose, a 3rd-generation Bramwell resident, had transformed his family's property into a commercial venture after spelunkers discovered extensive chambers beyond the cave's natural entrance. Montrose had invested heavily in infrastructure, installing electric lighting throughout the main tour route, constructing a visitor center, and hiring experienced guides who could balance education with entertainment. By the early 1990s, the attraction drew approximately 15,000 visitors annually, generating revenue that supported not just the Montrose family, but numerous local businesses that depended on tourist traffic. The cave tours ran daily from March through November, with each guide leading groups of 12 to 20 people through passages that showcased stalactites, stalagmites, and underground pools that reflected the lights in shimmering patterns. Amanda's initial meeting with Gerard Montrose took place in his office above the visitor center. A wood-paneled room decorated with framed photographs of the cave's most impressive formations and newspaper clippings celebrating the attraction's various milestones. Montrose, 58 years old with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades managing both land and people, explained that he wanted to assess the feasibility of opening a new section called the Cathedral Chamber, a massive room that early surveys had identified but never developed for public access. He provided Amanda with copies of previous geological reports, visitor safety records, and detailed maps of the existing tour routes. Everything appeared thoroughly professional and well documented. Montrose emphasized that safety was paramount, that no expansion would proceed without complete confidence in structural stability, and that he trusted her expertise to guide the decision. Amanda found him cordial, knowledgeable about his property, and genuinely invested in preserving the cave's natural beauty while sharing it responsibly with the public. The cave's lead guide was a man named Russell Brandt, 43 years old, who had worked at Whispering Caverns since its opening in 1974. Brandt lived alone in a small house on the edge of Bramwell, had never married, and was known throughout the community as someone whose entire identity revolved around the cave. He could identify every formation by memory, recite the geological history of the limestone deposits with academic precision, and had led thousands of tours without a single safety incident. Other guides respected him. Tourists praised him in comment cards, and Montrose considered him irreplaceable. Amanda met Brandt on her second day, when he volunteered to escort her into sections of the cave not accessible to regular tour groups. He was soft-spoken, almost shy in conversation, but transformed into an animated educator once underground, his flashlight beam dancing across rock formations as he explained their development over millennia. During that first week, Amanda established her routine. She would arrive at the visitor center by 8 a.m., review maps and previous reports, then spend 4 to 6 hours underground taking measurements, documenting geological features, and testing stability of potential expansion routes. Brandt accompanied her on most of these excursions, serving as both guide and assistant. He seemed genuinely excited about the Cathedral Chamber project, describing it as the culmination of his career to help open such a significant space to the public. Amanda noticed that he knew shortcuts and passages not marked on any official map, explaining that years of exploration had given him knowledge of the cave system that no document could capture. She appreciated his expertise, though she occasionally felt uneasy about the intensity of his attachment to the underground environment. The way he sometimes paused in dark passages and seemed to be listening to something she could not hear. The first anomaly appeared on Friday of that first week. Amanda was reviewing visitor logs from the past 5 years, cross-referencing them with maintenance records and guide schedules, when she noticed an odd pattern. 3 times since 1987, tour groups had been cut short and evacuated from the cave mid-tour, always led by Russell Brandt, always citing equipment malfunction or guest illness. The evacuation records were sparse, offering minimal detail, but what struck Amanda was that, in each case, subsequent inspection reports found no equipment problems and no medical documentation of any guest requiring treatment. She mentioned this casually to Montrose during their weekly check-in, framing it as simple curiosity about operational protocols. Montrose's response was measured but slightly defensive. He explained that Brandt was extremely cautious, sometimes overly so, and had on occasion ended tours out of excessive concern for safety when no actual danger existed. The evacuations had been inconvenient but harmless, and Montrose had addressed the issue privately with Brandt to ensure better judgment going forward. Amanda accepted this explanation but made a note in her field journal. Over the following days, she began paying closer attention to other details that might illuminate the pattern. She reviewed the cave's employment records and discovered that guide turnover was unusually high given the attraction's stability. In 18 years of operation, Whispering Caverns had employed 31 different tour guides, though only 8 positions existed at any given time. The average tenure was less than 3 years, with many guides leaving without notice or transferring to jobs in distant cities. Exit interviews were not documented. When Amanda asked one of the current guides, a young woman named Mallory Grimes, who had worked there for 8 months, about the turnover, Mallory hesitated before offering a vague answer about the job being more demanding than it appeared, and some people finding the cave environment oppressive over time. The breakthrough came during Amanda's 3rd week, when she and Brandt ventured into the deepest accessible section of the cave to assess the passage leading toward Cathedral Chamber. The route required crawling through a narrow tunnel for approximately 40 feet before emerging into a wider corridor. Amanda went first, her helmet lamp illuminating rough limestone walls that pressed close on both sides. When she emerged into the corridor and turned to help Brandt through, she noticed something she had not seen before: a side passage, barely 3 feet high, that branched off to the left. It was not marked on any map. When she asked Brandt about it, his entire demeanor changed. The friendly, talkative guide became rigid and quiet. He said the passage led nowhere, that it had been explored years ago and deemed unstable, and that Montrose had specifically prohibited any investigation of that route. His tone suggested the conversation was over. That evening, Amanda could not shake her curiosity. She returned to the visitor center after hours, using her access key to enter the records room. She searched through filing cabinets until she found a box labeled Historical Documentation 1970 to 1980, which contained the original surveys and exploration notes from before the cave became a commercial operation. Among yellowed papers and hand-drawn maps, she discovered a journal kept by one of the early spelunkers, a man named Carl Drummond, who had been part of the initial exploration team in 1973. The entries were detailed, technical, and increasingly disturbed in tone. Drummond described discovering the passage that Brandt had dismissed as unstable, noting that it descended at a sharp angle for nearly 200 feet before opening into what he called the listening chamber. His description was unsettling: a circular room with acoustics so strange that whispers seemed to echo from multiple directions at once, and a sense of presence so overwhelming that all 3 members of the exploration team had felt compelled to leave immediately. The final entry stated that Montrose had agreed the passage should be sealed and never mentioned to future tourists. But the passage was not sealed. Amanda had seen it herself. Someone had either reopened it, or the sealing had never actually occurred. The following morning, Amanda confronted Montrose with Drummond's journal. The cave owner's reaction was a mixture of frustration and resignation. He admitted that the passage had never been physically sealed because the cost and logistics were prohibitive, but it had been deliberately omitted from all official maps, and guides were instructed to ignore it. He claimed the decision was purely practical. The route was too difficult for tourist access and offered nothing of value compared to the developed sections. When Amanda pressed about the listening chamber and the exploration team's discomfort, Montrose became dismissive, characterizing it as superstition and the natural human tendency to feel uneasy in unfamiliar subterranean spaces. He reminded her that her contract was to assess Cathedral Chamber, not to investigate historical exploration notes, and suggested she focus on the assigned work. Amanda agreed outwardly, but privately decided to investigate further. She reached out to Carl Drummond through public records and discovered he had moved to Tennessee in 1975 and had since passed away in 1989. However, she located one of the other original explorers, a woman named Judith Calloway, who now lived in Lexington. Amanda drove there on her day off and interviewed Judith in her home. The woman, now 64 years old, remembered the Whispering Caverns exploration vividly. She confirmed everything in Drummond's journal and added disturbing details. The listening chamber had an opening in the floor, a chasm that dropped into darkness beyond the reach of their lights. They had lowered a weighted rope to measure its depth, but never reached bottom. More unsettling was the sound, a low, rhythmic noise like breathing that seemed to come from the chasm itself. All three explorers had experienced intense anxiety in that room, a feeling that they were being observed by something hostile. Judith had refused to return after that single visit. She asked Amanda why Montrose had hired someone to investigate now, after all these years. When Amanda explained it was for expansion purposes, Judith's face darkened. She said Montrose knew exactly what was in that cave, and if he was opening new sections, he was either desperate or reckless. Amanda returned to Bramwell with a growing sense that her geological assessment had intersected with something far more complex than subterranean architecture. She began reviewing records with new focus, looking for any evidence that the listening chamber or the chasm might have factored into the cave's operational history. What she found was a pattern of suppression. In 1988, a guide named Troy Ashburn had filed a written complaint with Montrose, claiming that Russell Brandt was taking unauthorized solo trips into closed sections of the cave during off hours. Montrose's response, documented in a terse memo, stated that Brandt had permission to conduct maintenance checks and that Ashburn should focus on his assigned duties. Ashburn quit 2 weeks later. In 1990, a maintenance worker named Felix Granger had reported finding items near the entrance to the Forbidden Passage, specifically a camping lantern, a notebook, and what he described as carved symbols on the cave wall. Montrose's response to this report was even more dismissive, stating that previous explorers must have left the items decades earlier, and that Granger was not qualified to interpret geological markings. On her 22nd day in Bramwell, Amanda made a decision that would define the rest of her assignment. She equipped herself with a full complement of safety gear, a thermal imaging camera, rope, and emergency supplies, and entered the cave at 2 a.m. when she knew no one else would be present. She navigated to the Forbidden Passage using her GPS unit and detailed notes from Drummond's journal. The descent was treacherous, requiring technical climbing skills and careful anchoring of rope systems. The walls were damp, The air grew noticeably colder, and the silence was absolute in a way that felt unnatural. After nearly an hour of difficult descent, she reached the listening chamber. The room was exactly as Drummond had described, circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with walls so smooth they appeared polished. The acoustic properties were immediately apparent. Her breathing echoed in strange patterns, seeming to come from multiple locations simultaneously. In the center of the floor was the chasm, a circular opening roughly 6 feet across, bordered by worn limestone that suggested regular contact. Amanda approached carefully and aimed her thermal camera into the darkness. The screen showed nothing for several seconds, then suddenly registered a heat signature approximately 40 feet down. It was roughly human-sized, but with an elongated shape that did not conform to normal body proportions. As she watched, the signature moved, not upward toward her, but laterally, as if crawling along a ledge or wall she could not see. Then she heard the breathing. It was exactly as Judith had described, rhythmic, deep, and emanating from the chasm, with a resonance that vibrated through the stone beneath her feet. Amanda's rational mind cataloged possible explanations: underground water flow, air pressure differentials, acoustic anomalies caused by the chamber's shape. But her instincts screamed a different message. She was not alone in this room. Something in the chasm was aware of her presence. She retreated immediately, documenting everything with photographs and thermal recordings. The climb back to the main cave system took 90 minutes, and by the time she emerged into the pre-dawn darkness outside, she had made her decision. She would report her findings to Montrose, recommend against any expansion that might connect to the listening chamber passage, and complete her contracted assessment as quickly as possible. But when she arrived at the visitor center later that morning, she learned that Russell Brandt had not reported for work. His house had been found empty, his truck still parked in the driveway, and no one had seen him since the previous afternoon. The search for Brandt mobilized the entire town. Local sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and dozens of concerned residents organized into search teams covering the surrounding hills and cave entrances. Amanda joined the effort, focusing on the cave system where Brandt had spent most of his life. What the searchers did not know, what Amanda had not yet revealed, was that she had left a motion-activated camera near the listening chamber entrance during her unauthorized descent. When she retrieved the camera's memory card on the second day of searching, the footage showed Russell Brandt entering the forbidden passage at approximately 8 p.m. the previous evening, carrying a lantern and moving with the confidence of someone who had made the journey many times before. The timestamp indicated he had descended toward the listening chamber just hours after Amanda had left it. Amanda brought this evidence to Sheriff Dale Kopecky, a career law enforcement officer who had served Bramwell for 16 years and knew every resident by name. Kopecky watched the footage in grim silence, then asked Amanda to explain how she had obtained it. When she admitted to her unauthorized cave entry and described what she had discovered in the listening chamber, Kopecky's expression shifted from concern to something darker. He told her to say nothing about the footage or her investigation, that he would handle it personally, and that her safety would be at risk if certain people learned what she knew. When Amanda demanded to know what he meant, Kopecky revealed that he had been quietly investigating Russell Brandt for 18 months, following up on rumors that the guide had been involved in activities far beyond his official duties at the cave. According to Kopecky, at least 4 people who had worked at Whispering Caverns had reported disturbing experiences involving Brandt and the cave's unexplored sections. These reports described unauthorized rituals, strange symbols carved into cave walls, and Brandt's increasingly obsessive belief that something lived in the deepest parts of the cave system, something he communicated with and served. Kopecky had documented these reports, but had insufficient evidence for formal charges, and Montrose had consistently protected Brandt, dismissing all allegations as workplace rumors or misunderstandings. The sheriff believed Montrose knew exactly what Brandt was doing, but considered it either harmless eccentricity or deliberately overlooked it to avoid scandal that might damage the cave attraction's reputation. The search reached its conclusion on the 5th day when a professional cave rescue team from the State Emergency Services lowered a climber into the chasm beneath the listening chamber. At approximately 200 feet down, in a narrow crevice that branched off from the main shaft, they found Russell Brandt's body. He was wedged into the space in a position that suggested he had been crawling when he became trapped, his clothing torn and his hands bloodied from desperate attempts to free himself. The medical examiner later determined he had died from asphyxiation and exposure, likely within 12 hours of entering the cave. But the disturbing detail that the rescue team emphasized was his expression. His eyes were open, his mouth frozen in a scream, and his face showed signs of extreme terror, despite no evidence of physical attack or injury beyond the self-inflicted damage from his struggle to escape the crevice. The cave was immediately closed, pending a full investigation. Amanda provided all her documentation, including the thermal camera footage from her initial descent, to Sheriff Kopecky and to state investigators who arrived to examine the site. What emerged from that investigation was a portrait of systematic deception and institutional negligence that had persisted for nearly 2 decades. Russell Brandt had been making unauthorized descents into the forbidden passage for years, leaving evidence of his presence in the form of carved symbols, burned candles, and written notes that suggested a progressively deteriorating mental state. He had become convinced that an entity existed in the deepest parts of the cave, something ancient and aware that communicated through the acoustic anomalies of the listening chamber. His notes described conversations, commands, and a growing compulsion to serve this presence by bringing it offerings and maintaining secrecy about its existence. Gerard Montrose was charged with criminal negligence and operating an unsafe tourist attraction. Investigators determined that he had known about Brandt's activities for years, but had actively suppressed information to protect the cave's commercial viability. Multiple former employees came forward during the investigation, describing incidents where they had witnessed Brandt behaving erratically, heard strange sounds from closed sections of the cave, or been explicitly threatened by Montrose when they attempted to report concerns. The prosecution presented evidence that at least 3 separate safety violations had been deliberately concealed, that inspection records had been falsified, and that Montrose had created an environment where employees feared retaliation for reporting problems. In 1994, Montrose was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison. Whispering Caverns never reopened. Amanda Smith completed her geological report, recommending that the entire cave system be sealed and protected as a natural preserve rather than developed for further commercial use. The state accepted her recommendation. In 1995, the cathedral chamber passage was permanently sealed with concrete barriers, and the entrance to the listening chamber passage was collapsed using controlled explosives. The visitor center was demolished, and the property was transferred to state management as protected land with no public access. The town of Bramwell never recovered its economic stability. The loss of the cave attraction eliminated nearly 30% of local employment and devastated the small businesses that had depended on tourist traffic. Population declined steadily through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Today, Bramwell's population has shrunk to fewer than 400 residents. Main Street stands largely empty, with half the storefronts boarded up and the Historical Society building converted into storage. The site of the cave entrance is marked only by a chain-link fence and a weathered sign warning of unstable terrain. Amanda left Kentucky immediately after completing her testimony and never accepted another consulting contract involving cave systems. She now works as a university professor in Montana, teaching geology and occasionally giving lectures about the importance of prioritizing safety and transparency over commercial interests in natural resource management. She describes the Whispering Caverns experience as the defining moment of her career, the point at which she understood that institutions built on secrecy and profit could corrupt even the most fundamental duty to protect human life. The thermal camera footage from her descent into the listening chamber has never been publicly released, though she confirmed in a 2018 interview that it showed exactly what she documented in her original report, a heat signature that moved with deliberate purpose in a space where no living thing should have existed. The question of what Russell Brand believed he had found in the depths beneath Bramwell, and whether his belief reflected genuine discovery or progressive mental deterioration, remains unanswered. What is certain is that a respected institution, trusted by thousands of visitors and defended by powerful local interests, concealed systematic evidence of danger for nearly 2 decades. The cave that had defined Bramwell's identity and sustained its economy became the site of a death that exposed how easily communities sacrifice truth for stability, and how institutions transform into instruments of suppression when those in authority decide that secrecy serves them better than honesty. The listening chamber remains sealed beneath Kentucky limestone, and whatever sounds echo in that darkness now, no one will hear them again. In the spring of 2011, Millbrook, Kansas, population 847, sat squarely in the heart of Tornado Alley, a stretch of the Great Plains where volatile weather patterns had shaped not just the landscape, but the psychology of everyone who called it home. For generations, families here had lived by the rhythms of storm seasons, the wail of sirens, and the instinct to seek shelter when the sky turned green. Storm cellars were as common as front porches, dug deep into red clay soil, reinforced with concrete and steel, stocked with flashlights and bottled water. They were places of salvation, symbols of survival against nature's most violent outbursts. The Brennan family, Dale, his wife Lorraine, and their 2 children, 11-year-old Marcus and 8-year-old Stella, had lived on County Road 14 for 6 years, in a modest 2-story farmhouse with white siding and a tin roof that rattled in high winds. Dale worked as a crop insurance adjuster, a job that kept him intimately familiar with the destructive capacity of severe weather. Lorraine taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. By all accounts, they were prepared people, cautious people, the kind who checked weather forecasts twice a day during storm season and kept their shelter meticulously maintained. On the evening of April 27, 2011, the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Barton County at 6:13 p.m. Doppler radar showed a supercell moving northeast at 45 miles per hour, with rotation signatures indicating a high probability of tornado genesis. Dale received the alert on his phone while the family was finishing dinner. Within minutes, they had gathered their emergency bag and descended the 12 concrete steps into their storm shelter, a structure Dale had personally inspected and upgraded the previous fall, installing a new ventilation system and replacing the heavy steel doors, hinges, and locking mechanism. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing and unexplainable incidents in Kansas emergency response history, an event that would force investigators to confront possibilities that defied rational explanation and left a small community questioning whether some shelters protect against storms or trap families with something far worse. When the tornado touched down 7 miles southwest of Millbrook at 6:41 p.m., it carved an EF3 path of destruction across open farmland, damaging barns and outbuildings, but sparing most residential structures. The Brennan property sustained minimal damage, scattered debris, some missing shingles, a downed fence line. Emergency responders conducting systematic welfare checks the following morning noted that the house appeared intact and assumed the family had either evacuated or emerged safely from their shelter. It was Dale's brother, Glenn Brennan, who made the discovery on April 29th, 2 days after the storm. Unable to reach Dale by phone and growing concerned after repeated unanswered calls, Glenn drove out from Wichita. He found the house empty, lights still on, dinner dishes unwashed in the sink. The storm shelter door, located 30 feet from the back porch beneath a concrete housing, was closed. Glenn called out. No response. He pulled on the exterior handle, locked from the inside as it should be during a storm. He knocked, then pounded. Silence. Fighting rising panic, Glenn called the Barton County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Keith Rowan arrived at 11:47 a.m. with a bolt cutter. When they finally forced the door open and descended into the shelter, what they found would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. All 4 members of the Brennan family were dead. But their deaths bore none of the hallmarks of typical shelter-related fatalities. No signs of carbon monoxide poisoning's peaceful sleep. No evidence of structural collapse or debris impact. No indication of suffocation or medical emergency. Instead, the scene suggested something that made no logical sense. They appeared to have died of sheer overwhelming terror. Dale Brennan was found in the far corner of the 12 by 10 foot shelter, his body pressed against the concrete wall as if trying to push through it. His eyes were open, pupils fully dilated, mouth frozen in a grimace of absolute horror. Lorraine lay near the bottom of the stairs, one arm outstretched toward the door, her face contorted in an expression of desperate pleading. The children were huddled together against the eastern wall, Stella's small hands clutching her brother's shirt. But it was the physical evidence surrounding their bodies that elevated the scene from tragic to inexplicable. Deep scratches covered the interior surface of the steel door, particularly concentrated around the locking mechanism. Some gouges penetrated the paint down to bare metal. Several of Lorraine's fingernails had been torn completely off, blood smears marking where her hands had clawed at the door. But what stopped Deputy Rowan cold was the additional set of scratches, distinct parallel grooves carved into the concrete ceiling and upper walls, 7 to 8 feet above the floor, far beyond the reach of any family member even standing on the shelter storage bench. The scratches weren't random. They formed deliberate patterns, almost symbols, etched with force sufficient to remove concrete aggregate and leave bright white marks in the structural material. The depth and precision suggested metal tools or something with similar hardness, yet no such implements were found in the shelter. Dr. Helena Cross, the Barton County medical examiner, performed the autopsies with growing bewilderment. All 4 victims showed identical physiological markers: massive adrenaline surge, acute stress response, and what she described in her preliminary report as catastrophic autonomic nervous system failure consistent with extreme psychological trauma. Their hearts had essentially stopped from fear. Not a medical impossibility, but exceptionally rare, and virtually unheard of in multiple victims simultaneously. Time of death was estimated at approximately 7:15 p.m. on April 27th, roughly 1 hour after they had entered the shelter. No external injuries, no toxicological findings, no pre-existing conditions that would explain sudden cardiac arrest in 4 healthy individuals. Sheriff Tom Aldrich ordered a comprehensive investigation. The shelter was photographed, measured, and analyzed by a forensic team from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. What they documented only deepened the mystery. The shelter's environmental monitoring equipment, part of Dale's recent upgrades, had recorded data throughout the event. The digital log showed normal conditions until 7:02 p.m. when the carbon monoxide detector registered a sudden spike. But the readings were impossible. The device recorded levels of 95% sulfur dioxide, a concentration that would require an industrial source and would be instantly lethal. Yet the detector was functioning properly when tested, and sulfur dioxide, a gas with a pungent odor, doesn't occur naturally in sealed concrete shelters. More disturbing, the temperature log showed a sharp drop from 68 degrees Fahrenheit to 41 degrees in less than 3 minutes, then a return to normal by 7:20 p.m. The barometric pressure reading indicated a sudden increase of 2.3 millibars, the opposite of what would occur during a tornado's low-pressure system, followed by normalization. The ventilation system, designed to allow air circulation while maintaining shelter integrity, showed no mechanical failures. Air samples collected from the sealed space contained no unusual compounds, no carbon monoxide, no sulfur dioxide, nothing that could explain the detector's logged readings or the family's deaths. Investigators found one additional piece of evidence that would become the source of endless speculation and analysis. Dale's phone, discovered on the floor near his body, contained a video file time-stamped at 7:11 p.m. The footage was brief, 18 seconds, captured in the dim light of the shelter's emergency LED strips. The camera showed Dale's face, his expression shifting from confusion to mounting terror as he attempted to speak. The audio was corrupted, filled with static and a low-frequency hum that drowned out words. But in the final 3 seconds, before the video cut to black, the camera panned briefly to show the shelter's interior. The forensic audio team enhanced the recording. Beneath the static, they isolated what sounded like breathing. Slow, rhythmic, but far too deep and resonant to be human. And in the background, barely audible, A series of tapping sounds that matched neither the storm's impact on the exterior housing nor any mechanical component of the shelter system. Sheriff Aldrich brought in specialists, structural engineers to examine the shelter's integrity, meteorologists to review atmospheric data, and even a team from Kansas State University's Department of Psychological Sciences to consult on group panic phenomena. Every expert reached the same conclusion. The evidence didn't align with any known mechanism of death or environmental hazard. The structural engineers confirmed the shelter was sound, properly ventilated, and showed no signs of gas leaks or containment failures. The meteorologists verified that the tornado had passed more than a mile from the property and that no unusual atmospheric conditions had been recorded in the immediate area. The psychologists acknowledged that shared panic could theoretically trigger sympathetic stress responses, but not with this level of physical evidence or environmental anomalies. The investigation was further complicated by the testimony of Glenn Brennan and two neighbors who had driven past the Brennan property on the evening of April 27th. All three reported seeing the exterior shelter housing's concrete lid closed and undisturbed, exactly as it should be during a storm event. None noticed anything unusual, no lights, no sounds, no indication of distress. Yet at some point, between 6:30 p.m. and 7:15 p.m., something had happened in that sealed concrete room that had driven a prepared, rational family to die clawing at walls they knew were impenetrable. The case was officially classified as undetermined deaths with suspicious circumstances. No criminal charges were filed because there was no suspect, no clear cause, and no actionable evidence of foul play. The shelter was sealed by county order pending further investigation, but no further investigation ever materialized. The questions were too uncomfortable, the implications too unsettling for the kind of definitive answers that investigative reports require. For 6 months, the Brennan property sat empty, a chain-link fence installed around the perimeter by the estate executor. The house would eventually be sold to a development company based in Oklahoma City. But before that transaction could close, something happened that would ensure the property's permanent abandonment. In October 2011, Glenn Brennan hired a local contractor, Wayne Hollis, to clear the property and prepare it for sale. Wayne, a 52-year-old who had built half the storm shelters in Barton County, agreed to inspect and clean the Brennan shelter as part of the work. He had known Dale personally, had in fact helped with the ventilation upgrades the previous fall, and felt a sense of obligation to ensure the space was properly decommissioned. Wayne entered the shelter alone on the morning of October 12th, carrying industrial cleaning supplies and work lights. According to his later statement to Sheriff Aldrich, the interior appeared exactly as it had been left. Blood stains on the door, scratch marks on the walls, the family's emergency supplies still on the storage bench. He had been working for approximately 10 minutes, documenting the space with photographs for insurance purposes, when the steel door slammed shut behind him. The sound, he said, was like a gunshot in the confined space. Wayne immediately moved to the door, assuming wind or a faulty hinge had caused the closure. The locking mechanism had engaged. He tried to open it from the inside using the standard release handle. It didn't budge. He pushed harder. Nothing. The door, which had operated smoothly during his initial inspection, was now sealed as if welded shut. Wayne called out, hoping someone outside might hear, but he was alone on the property. He reached for his phone. No signal, not unusual in a concrete shelter, but he had specifically checked before descending and had shown full bars. His work lights flickered. Then the temperature dropped. In his formal statement, Wayne described a sensation of intense cold that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the concrete had become ice. His breath formed visible clouds. The LED work lights dimmed to a faint amber glow, and then came the pressure change, a feeling of weight pressing down on his chest and ears, similar to rapid altitude change but far more oppressive. He heard the voice through the ventilation duct. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like syllables stretched and distorted, a wet whisper that seemed to form shapes in the air. Wayne couldn't understand it, couldn't parse meaning from the sounds, but the tone conveyed something unmistakable. Malice, hunger, and a terrible patience. Then he felt the touch on his neck. Cold fingers, light as air but unmistakably deliberate, trailing from his collar to his hairline. There was nothing behind him. He spun, work light raised like a weapon, illuminating only empty concrete and shadows. Wayne Hollis began screaming and hammering on the door with a wrench from his tool belt. For 6 minutes, according to the timestamp on the video he later showed investigators, he struck the door with enough force to bend the tool's handle. The scratches on the ceiling he noticed during this frenzy seemed to glow faintly in the dimness, like phosphorescence on deep-sea creatures. The door released at 10:34 a.m. without warning. Wayne fell backward as it swung open, scrambled up the stairs, and ran to his truck. He drove directly to the sheriff's office and refused to return to the property under any circumstances. His hands shook for 3 days. He moved his family to Topeka 6 weeks later and started telling people he had taken a job opportunity, though friends said he seemed haunted, diminished, fundamentally changed by something he would never fully describe. Sheriff Aldrich ordered the shelter permanently closed. A concrete crew from Great Bend filled the entire structure: walls, ceilings, stairs, and the underground room itself, with 47 cubic yards of cement. They worked quickly, pouring continuously until the shelter was a solid block of concrete extending 8 feet below grade. The exterior housing was demolished and the site leveled. The county placed a permanent notation on the property deed: former storm shelter location, not suitable for reconstruction or excavation. The house was never rebuilt. The Oklahoma Development Company withdrew their purchase offer after learning of Wayne Hollis's experience and the subsequent sealing operation. For 2 years, the property remained on the market at steadily declining prices before being purchased by a land conservation trust that designated it as permanent open space, essentially ensuring it would never be developed or inhabited again. Millbrook, a town that prided itself on preparedness and resilience in the face of natural disasters, fell silent on the subject of the Brennan family. The elementary school where Lorraine had taught established a memorial scholarship in her name, but the dedication plaque made no mention of how she died. The local newspaper ran a single article summarizing the deaths as weather-related tragedy, then never referenced the incident again. In the years since April 2011, several atmospheric scientists and paranormal researchers have requested access to the original evidence and investigative files. Sheriff Aldrich, who retired in 2018, has consistently declined, citing family privacy and the ongoing sensitivity of the case. The forensic reports remain sealed by court order. The enhanced audio from Dale's phone has never been publicly released, though technicians who worked on the file have described it in off-record conversations as the most disturbing sound recording I've ever encountered. Glenn Brennan moved to Oregon and has not returned to Kansas. He refuses interviews and changed his phone number after receiving calls from people wanting to discuss his brother's death. Wayne Hollis died of a heart attack in 2019, but his widow found journal entries describing recurring nightmares about the shelter, dreams of endless concrete rooms, voices in ventilation ducts, and hands emerging from walls. The tornado season of 2011 was one of the deadliest in U.S. history, with 1,691 confirmed tornadoes and 553 fatalities nationwide. But the Brennan family's deaths remain unique in the annals of severe weather mortality, a case where the shelter that should have saved them became the site of something that defied every protocol, every safety measure, and every rational explanation emergency responders had been trained to expect. Millbrook's population has declined to 704 as of the 2020 census. Several families have relocated, citing unspecified concerns about the town's safety. The remaining residents don't talk about the Brennans, don't speculate about what happened in that sealed room, and have installed new storm shelters with multiple exits, external communication systems, and battery-powered emergency releases that can be activated from outside. But on April 27th each year, when the anniversary arrives and storm warnings inevitably sound across Tornado Alley, some families in Millbrook choose to ride out the weather above ground, doors unlocked, windows open to the green sky. They have made a calculation that death by wind and debris might be preferable to whatever waits in the darkness below, in spaces dug deep into earth that sometimes holds more than clay and stone. The sealed shelter at the former Brennan property sits beneath grass and wildflowers now, its concrete tomb unmarked and undisturbed. But Wayne Hollis's testimony, Glenn Brennan's haunted silence, and Dr. Cross's autopsies all point to the same impossible conclusion: that on the evening of April 27, 2011, 4 people descended into shelter and encountered something that had been waiting there, something that locked the door from the inside and took its time showing them what true terror looks like when there is nowhere left to run. Detective Corbin Ashworth had been with the Vermont State Police for 16 years, and in all that time, he had never received a call quite like the one that came through on the morning of March 4th, 2015. The Secretary of State's office was reporting that the town of Millbrook Falls, population 247, tucked into the northeastern corner of Caledonia County, had failed to transmit their town meeting results. This was more than a clerical oversight. In Vermont, where town meetings were sacred civic rituals dating back to colonial times, where every March the citizens gathered to vote on budgets, elect officers, and debate the minutiae of local governance, a failure to report was unthinkable. It was a thread in the fabric of democratic tradition, and when that thread went missing, someone had to investigate. Corbin received the assignment not because of any particular expertise in municipal affairs, but because he happened to be stationed in St. Johnsbury, the nearest city of any size, and because every other detective in the barracks was tied up with a meth trafficking case that had consumed the better part of the winter. He accepted the task with the weary resignation of a man who assumed he would find nothing more sinister than aging town clerks who had forgotten to file paperwork or a faulty fax machine. He was 43 years old, divorced, with a daughter in college who rarely called, and he had learned to expect the mundane over the extraordinary. Small towns, in his experience, were havens of boredom punctuated by the occasional drunk driving arrest or domestic dispute. They were not places where mysteries unfolded. The drive to Millbrook Falls took just over an hour, winding through forests still cloaked in the gray remnants of winter. Snow lined the roadways and dirty banks, and the trees stood bare and skeletal against an overcast sky. The town itself appeared suddenly, a cluster of white-clapboard buildings arranged around a narrow main street. There was a general store, a post office, a small white church with a modest steeple. And at the far end of the street, the town hall, a 2-story structure built in the federal style with green shutters and a brass plaque beside the door, commemorating its construction in 1824. It was the kind of place that appeared on postcards and calendars, a vision of New England charm that tourists drove through on their way to ski resorts. But as Corbin pulled his unmarked sedan to a stop in front of the town hall, he noticed something that made him pause. The building was dark, the windows were shuttered, and the front door, which should have been unlocked during business hours, was secured with a heavy padlock. He stepped out of the car into the cold. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. The street was empty. No pedestrians, no cars moving. He could see a few houses farther up the road, their chimneys releasing thin columns of smoke, signs of life within. But there was no one outside. No one, walking dogs or shoveling driveways or chatting on porches. Just a silence, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Corbin approached the town hall, his breath misting in the frigid air. He tried the door, confirmed the padlock, then circled the building. Every window on the ground floor was shuttered from the inside. He peered through a gap in one shutter and saw only darkness. He knocked on the door, called out, identified himself as state police. No response. He walked to the general store, a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read, Millbrook Mercantile. A bell chimed as he pushed open the door. Inside the store was cramped and dimly lit, shelves stocked with canned goods, fishing supplies, and tourist trinkets. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s, thin and pale, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She watched him with unblinking eyes as he approached. Corbin introduced himself, explained that he was investigating the town's failure to report their meeting results, and asked if she knew why the town hall was locked. The woman, who gave her name as Lorraine Pickett, stared at him for a long moment before answering. Her voice was flat, devoid of inflection. The town council had their meeting on the 1st, she said. That was 3 days ago. They were still in there, as far as she knew. Still in there doing their work. She hadn't seen them come out. Corbin felt a prickle of unease. He asked if she had a key to the hall. She shook her head. Only the town clerk had keys, she said. And the clerk was in the meeting. Corbin asked for the clerk's name and home address. Lorraine gave him directions to a house, a quarter-mile up the road, a small Cape Cod with blue trim. But when Corbin drove there and knocked on the door, no one answered. The curtains were drawn. The driveway was empty. He returned to the center of town, now deeply unsettled, and called his barracks. He requested assistance and a locksmith. While he waited, he walked the perimeter of the town hall again, this time checking the rear entrance. It too was locked. But here he found something that made his stomach tighten. The door was secured from the outside with a heavy timber beam slotted through iron brackets. Someone had barricaded the council inside. By the time the locksmith arrived, accompanied by a second state trooper named Officer Leanne Burgess, the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The locksmith, a gruff man named Terrence Hale, who drove up from Lindenville, made quick work of the padlock. Corbin and Leanne drew their sidearms as a precaution, then pushed open the door. The smell hit them first. A thick, coppery odor mingled with something else, something acrid and burnt. Leanne gagged and stepped back. Corbin forced himself forward, clicking on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the town hall. The main room was a large open space with hardwood floors and a raised stage at the far end. In the center of the room was a long oak table, and seated around that table were 7 people. They were dead. All of them. Seated upright in their chairs, hands clasped together in a chain around the table, forming an unbroken ring. Their heads had been obliterated, reduced to ragged stumps atop their shoulders. The walls and ceiling splattered with blood and tissue. The smell was unbearable. Corbin's hand trembled as he swept the flashlight over the scene. He had seen death before, car accidents and overdoses, and even a murder-suicide once. But nothing like this. Nothing so methodical. Nothing so strange. He called for Leanne to radio for backup, for the medical examiner, for crime scene investigators. His voice sounded distant in his own ears, as though someone else were speaking. While they waited for the response teams to arrive, Corbin forced himself to examine the room more carefully, stepping around the table in a wide arc to avoid disturbing potential evidence. The 7 individuals matched the descriptions of the town council members listed in the Secretary of State's records: the town clerk, the select board chair, 3 other select board members, the treasurer, and the moderator. Their identification cards were laid out on the table in front of each body. On the table's surface, centered among them, was a large leather-bound book, the town meeting minutes book, used to record official proceedings. Corbin opened it carefully with gloved hands. The most recent entries were dated March 1st, 2015, the day of the town meeting. They documented the usual business: appropriations for road maintenance, election of officers, discussion of a new fire truck. The handwriting was neat and varied, clearly written by different hands. But then, after the final official entry, the writing continued. Page after page after page, filled with minutes for future meetings. March 2016, March 2017, March 2020, the entries stretched forward in time, documenting meetings that had not yet occurred, decisions not yet made, budgets not yet proposed. The handwriting changed as he read, gradually losing its individual character. By the entries dated 2030, all the words were written in the same strange, uniform scrawl, as though a single hand had written them all. By 2050, the final page, the writing was barely legible, cramped, obsessive, the letters overlapping and bleeding together. The state police response was swift. By nightfall, the town hall was cordoned off. Crime scene investigators were photographing and documenting every inch of the room, and the medical examiner had begun the grim work of processing the bodies. Preliminary findings suggested that the heads hadn't been destroyed by gunshots or explosives, but by some form of catastrophic internal pressure, as though the skulls had burst from within. Leanne, who had been interviewing townspeople, reported that no one claimed to have heard anything unusual on the night of March 1st. No gunshots, no screams, no commotion, just silence. Several residents mentioned that they had seen lights on in the town hall late into the night, but that was normal for a town meeting day, when council business often ran long. no one had thought to check on them. Corbin remained at the scene through the night, coordinating with investigators and trying to piece together what could have happened. It was Officer Burgess who discovered the tape recorder. It was sitting on a side table near the stage, a small digital device with a built-in microphone, the kind used to record public meetings for archival purposes. Vermont's open meeting law required that all town meetings be recorded and made available to the public upon request. Corbin had forgotten about this detail, but when Leanne brought him the recorder, he felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Whatever had happened in this room, it would be on that tape. He bagged the recorder as evidence and drove it back to the barracks in St. Johnsbury, where he checked it into the evidence locker. It was 3 a.m. by the time he returned home, and he did not sleep. The next morning, after filing preliminary reports and attending a briefing with his superiors, Corbin requested permission to review the audio recording. He was granted access and retreated to a small office with a tape player and a set of headphones. He pressed play. For the first 20 minutes, the recording was exactly what he expected. The sounds of a routine town meeting, voices calling the meeting to order, reading through the warrant articles, debating budgets and bylaws. He recognized some of the voices from the identification cards he had seen on the bodies. The town clerk, a woman named Joanna Tremaine, had a warm, patient voice. The select board chair, a man named Glenn Pemberton, spoke with the slow cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. The discussions were mundane, almost boring. Votes were taken, motions were passed. There was nothing out of the ordinary until approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes into the recording. That was when the voices began to change. The individual tones and rhythms started to blur together, as though the speakers were unconsciously synchronizing their speech patterns. They began speaking in unison, reciting passages from the town charter, from old meeting minutes, from bylaws dating back to the 19th century. At first, it sounded like a rehearsed reading, but there was no pause, no break for breath, just continuous speech, overlapping and layering until it became a low, droning chant. And then, beneath the human voices, Corbin heard something else. A new sound, rising from the center of the recording, from the table itself. It was a buzzing, like the hum of electrical wires or the drone of a vast swarm of insects. It grew louder, overwhelming the voices, and Corbin could hear the words of the chant dissolving into pure sound, syllables repeating and collapsing into a rhythmic pulse. He wanted to stop the tape, to tear off the headphones, but he could not. He was transfixed. His lips began to move, silently forming the words he was hearing. And then the recording ended with a sound he would never forget. A series of sharp, wet pops, like balloons bursting, followed by silence. Corbin sat in the office for a long time, the headphones still on, staring at the wall. His mouth was dry, his heart was pounding. He rewound the tape and played the final section again, this time listening with clinical detachment, trying to identify any patterns or clues. But all he heard was the chant, the buzzing, and the pops. He made notes. He transcribed what fragments of words he could discern. And then, as the daylight began to fade outside the office window, he made a decision. He needed to return to Millbrook Falls. He needed to understand what had happened to that town council and whether anyone else in the town was in danger. He arrived in Millbrook Falls just after dark, driving slowly down the empty main street. The town hall was still cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, but the rest of the town appeared unchanged. Lights glowed in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. But there was no one outside. Corbin parked his car in front of the general store and sat for a moment watching. He pulled out the tape recorder, which he had signed out from evidence under the pretext of needing to review it further. He told himself he would play it one more time just to confirm what he had heard. He pressed play. The chant began again, and this time in the enclosed space of his car, the sound seemed to fill every corner, to vibrate in his chest and skull. His lips moved. He found himself mouthing the words, syllables that had no meaning but felt ancient, felt necessary. His hand reached toward the volume dial, turning it up. The buzzing grew louder. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was not alone. All around his car, standing in the street and on the sidewalks and in the doorways of buildings, were the townspeople. Men, women, children, all perfectly still, all facing him. Their faces were illuminated by the street lamps and the glow from their own windows, and they were all smiling the same smile, a wide, empty expression that did not reach their eyes. Corbin's hand fumbled for the tape player. He hit the stop button. The chant ceased. The townspeople did not move. They simply stood there, watching him, waiting. He could see their lips moving just slightly, as though they were speaking words he could not hear. Lorraine Pickett from the general store was among them, standing in the doorway of her shop, her face slack and serene. The locksmith, Terrence Hale, stood beside a lamppost, still wearing his work jacket. And there were others, dozens of others, all frozen in place, all waiting. Corbin started his car with shaking hands. He threw it into reverse, spinning the tires on the icy pavement, and accelerated backward down the street. The townspeople did not pursue him. They did not move at all. They simply watched as he turned the car around and drove away, speeding out of Millbrook Falls and not slowing until he reached the highway. He drove for 20 minutes before pulling over to the shoulder, where he sat gasping for breath, his entire body trembling. He looked at the tape recorder on the passenger seat. Without thinking, without allowing himself to hesitate, he got out of the car, walked into the woods beside the road, and set the recorder on the ground. He pulled out his lighter, clicked it open, and held the flame to the device. The plastic casing caught fire quickly, melting and bubbling. He stood there until the entire recorder was reduced to a blackened lump, and then he returned to his car and drove back to St. Johnsbury. The official investigation into the Millbrook Falls incident concluded 2 months later. The medical examiner's final report attributed the deaths to a catastrophic failure of pressure regulation in the town hall's heating system, resulting in a buildup of carbon monoxide that caused asphyxiation, followed by post-mortem decomposition that simulated the appearance of burst skulls. This explanation satisfied no one who had actually seen the bodies, but it was the only explanation that fit within acceptable parameters of reality. The town of Millbrook Falls was officially dissolved by an act of the state legislature in May 2015, its territory absorbed into the neighboring town of Grafton Mills. The town hall was demolished. The residents were offered relocation assistance, though public records indicated that most declined and remained in their homes. Now, technically, residents of Grafton Mills. The minutes book was entered into evidence and then, according to official records, lost during a transfer between storage facilities. The audio recording was listed as damaged beyond recovery. No charges were filed. No further investigation was pursued. Detective Corbin Ashworth requested and received a transfer to the Burlington Police Department in June 2015. He cited personal reasons and a desire to work in a larger city with more resources. His request was granted without objection. In his final report on the Millbrook Falls case, he noted that while the official explanation provided closure for the families of the deceased, certain questions remained unanswered. He recommended that the town's dissolution be made permanent and that the site of the former town hall be left undeveloped. This recommendation was quietly accepted. The land remains vacant to this day, a small plot of weeds and broken foundation stones, marked by no sign or memorial. Corbin never spoke publicly about what he heard on that tape or what he saw in the street that night. In the years that followed, he rose through the ranks in Burlington, earned commendations, mentored younger detectives. He remarried. He reconciled with his daughter. He built a good life, a normal life, in a city where streetlights never went out and neighbors never stood motionless in the dark. But there were nights, usually in winter when the cold pressed against the windows and the darkness came early, when he would wake from dreams he could not remember, his lips moving silently, forming words that had no meaning, words that buzzed and droned in the back of his mind. And on those nights, he would lie awake until dawn, listening to the sounds of the city and reminding himself that he was far away from that small town in the northeast corner of the state. That town which no longer existed on any map. That place where 7 people died holding hands around a table. Their last act a chant that reached backward through centuries and forward into futures that would never come to pass. He told himself he had made the right choice, burning that tape, letting the official story stand. Some truths, he believed, were not meant to be preserved. Some silences were necessary, and some towns deserved to be forgotten.